Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we'll wander into one of the most dramatic moments our planet has ever lived through, though no one who walked the Earth at the time would have called it dramatic. To them, it was the end of the world. I'm talking about the day a space rock larger than Mount Everest came barreling down from the heavens and changed everything. Dinosaurs had ruled for more than 150 million years. They were not just the stars of their age, they were the entire cast, the supporting roles, the background extras, the voices in the crowd. But in one fiery instant, their story was cut short, and life on Earth was forced to improvise something new. You and I are here because of that accident, that cosmic misstep, that unimaginable stroke of chaos. Tonight, we'll walk slowly through what the Earth became after the impact, what it looked like, what it smelled like, what survived, what didn't, and how from the ashes of that nightmare something very familiar began to emerge. But before we begin this journey into Earth's deep memory, let me ask you something small, just between us. Where are you listening from right now? Is it morning for you, the sun pushing through your curtains as the world stirs awake, or is it night, with the sky dark and your thoughts winding down? Wherever you are on the clock, pause for a moment and picture that world long ago. The ground trembling, the air darkening, creatures that had never known fear suddenly staring at a sky they didn't understand. Strange, isn't it? How one event 66 million years ago can echo right into this quiet moment we're sharing. And if you find this slow exploration soothing, or intriguing, or just a pleasant way to drift at the end of your day, I'd be grateful if you tapped that like button, or maybe subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm reach others who might need it, and perhaps someone else out there, sleepless and searching, will stumble into this gentle detour through science and story, and find it just enough to ease them toward rest. Now let's begin, carefully, like we're stepping into a vast museum after hours. The lights are low, the air is still, and the exhibits are not bones in glass cases but living scenes. The Earth itself unfolding around us. Somewhere in that darkness, 66 million years ago, a rock fell from space. It struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico with the force of billions of atomic bombs. It carved a crater more than 100 miles wide and more than 12 miles deep. The impact released so much energy that the air itself turned to fire. That is the moment we're stepping into, though we won't stay with the impact too long. The blast is the beginning, but what fascinates us tonight is everything that came after. The strange and quiet hours when the planet had to reckon with what had happened. In those first hours, dust, vaporized rock and molten droplets were blasted high into the atmosphere. Imagine the sky lit not by stars but by countless burning fragments falling back down. Whole forests caught fire, stretching across continents. Animals fled, though there was nowhere safe to flee. The oceans boiled at their edges, great waves spreading outward from the impact zone. But what's remarkable isn't just the violence of that day, it's the stillness that followed. Imagine waking after the chaos, if you survived, to a world where the sun did not rise, where the air smelled of sulphur and ash, where daylight was dimmer than twilight, and where silence stretched for miles. That silence is where our story rests tonight, because the Earth after the impact was not immediately dead, but it was profoundly altered. As the dust spread high into the stratosphere, it wrapped the globe in a shroud. Sunlight could not pierce it easily. Temperatures began to fall. Photosynthesis, the process plants used to turn light into life, halted almost everywhere. The dinosaurs that survived the initial blast found themselves in a world without food. Leaf-eaters starved first, followed by the predators who depended on them. Insects scurried through the ash, some thriving, some vanishing. Mammals, small and often overlooked, huddled in burrows, living off seeds, roots, and anything they could gnaw. It's tempting to imagine that the end was quick, but it was not. For weeks, months, even years, Earth stayed in this twilight. Fires burned themselves out, the smoke joining the dust above. The oceans grew colder, and acid rain fell, turning rivers and lakes into hostile pools. You might wonder what it would have looked like to stand on that planet, to open your eyes and gaze around. The first thing would be the darkness, not pitch black but dim, like standing beneath heavy storm clouds that never lifted. The second would be the air itself, thick, gritty, hard to breathe. The world smelled like burning stone, sharp and sour, with every inhale carrying reminders of the catastrophe. The third would be the absence of sound. Forests gone quiet, rivers slowed by ash, the cries of creatures fewer and fewer each day. If you were lucky enough to survive, it must have felt like standing in the ruins of a world that was not coming back, and yet, deep below the soil, seeds waited. In the dark waters, small fish swam. Life, fragile but stubborn, had not given up. Scientists call this period the aftermath of the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, but that phrase doesn't quite capture the scale of what happened. More than 70% of all species vanished. Entire families of creatures erased. The dinosaurs, save for a small lineage that would become modern birds, were gone. The great marine reptiles, the flying pterosaurs, the ammonites that filled the seas, all gone. Yet here in the shadows, mammals began to stir. Small, furry, adaptable mammals. They had lived in the corners of the dinosaur world, unnoticed, unimportant. But after the asteroid, those corners became centre stage. With the giants gone, space opened up. Space to eat, space to grow, space to imagine new shapes. Out of that opening, eventually, much later, would come us. And that is why we begin this journey. Not because the asteroid ended the age of dinosaurs, but because it created the world that would one day welcome humans. It forced Earth into a reset, harsh and unforgiving, but also creative. From the ashes of forests came new kinds of plants. From the burrows of mammals came diversity. From oceans scoured of their rulers came fresh waves of evolution. The Earth after the impact was not just a graveyard, it was a workshop, a place of silence, then whispers, then voices rising again. So, settle in as we walk slowly through those days and years. We won't rush, because Earth didn't rush either. It took millions of years to recover, to rebuild ecosystems, to stabilize the climate, to repopulate forests and seas. Every step of that journey holds stories, some tragic, some surprising, all remarkable. And as we trace them tonight, we'll see not only what happened long ago, but also what it says about our present and our future. Because Earth has been through disaster before. It has been broken, scarred, and left for dead. But it has also healed, adapted, and flourished again. That is the story of our planet, and it begins in the long shadow of a falling star. It begins quietly. 66 million years ago, Earth spun through its usual rhythm. The continents sat in slightly different positions than today, but the oceans still rolled, the forests still whispered, and the skies were filled with wings. Dinosaurs wandered across plains, swam in rivers, and nested in forests. Some were massive, towering shapes that shook the ground with each step. Others were no larger than a dog, quick-footed and nervous, darting between ferns. Birds, already descended from their dinosaur ancestors, glided overhead, calling to one another in voices that might sound oddly familiar to us. Crocodiles slid into rivers, turtles sunned themselves, insects droned in the heat. To the creatures living then, it was just another day. Another morning of eating, hunting, resting, raising young. Nothing on Earth gave the slightest hint that this ordinary stretch of time would be the last of its kind. But above them, far beyond their sight, a rock was falling. Not a pebble, not a boulder, but a mountain hurled through space. This asteroid had been orbiting the sun for millions of years, nudged little by little by the gravitational pulls of planets until its path intersected perfectly, terribly, with Earth. It measured about 10 kilometers across, larger than Mount Everest, and it travelled at more than 20 kilometers per second. That speed is hard to grasp. In the time it takes you to blink, the rock covered the distance of several football fields. The dinosaurs could not see it coming. They had no telescopes, no warnings. To them the sky was the same as it always was, wide and bright, painted with drifting clouds. But somewhere above, the fate of their world was sealed. The moment of impact came with no prelude for those on the ground. In what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, the asteroid struck shallow water. The Gulf of Mexico at the time was dotted with reefs and teeming with life. In one instant, that life was erased. The energy released by the collision was greater than billions of nuclear bombs combined. The rock punched a crater more than 100 miles wide and 12 miles deep. The ground heaved, shock waves raced outward, and water was thrown into the sky higher than any mountain. The ocean itself seemed to leap in terror. The blast vaporized rock, soil and water into glowing plumes that shot beyond the atmosphere. For a moment, the Earth itself shuddered like a bell struck too hard. If you could have seen it from space, the sight would have been both mesmerizing and horrifying. A brilliant flash of light, brighter than the surface of the sun, spread across the planet. A fireball grew and expanded, glowing orange and white. Rings of debris blasted outward, glowing arcs that circled the globe. From orbit, Earth would have looked wounded, a blue and green sphere suddenly marred by a burning wound. For the creatures on the surface, there was no time to understand, no time to react. Anything within hundreds of kilometers was obliterated instantly, vaporized by heat and pressure. Forests turned to flame. Rivers boiled away. Animals caught in the open stood no chance. It was as if the entire region had been dropped into the heart of a volcano. The shock waves did not stop at the crater. They raced across the planet's crust, triggering earthquakes stronger than anything in human history. Mountains shook, valleys cracked, landslides roared down slopes. In oceans far from the impact, tsunamis rose higher than skyscrapers and surged toward distant shores. Imagine standing on a beach thousands of kilometers away, hearing a strange roar on the horizon, and seeing a wall of water rushing toward you faster than you could run. Coastal ecosystems were swept away in minutes. Creatures that had never seen waves higher than a few meters suddenly faced walls of water hundreds of meters tall. Above all this chaos, the sky began to rain fire. When the asteroid hit, it threw countless fragments of molten rock into space. These pieces arced high above the atmosphere and then fell back down across the globe. Re-entering the air, they glowed white-hot, turning the sky into a broiler. Forests thousands of kilometers from the crater burst into flames as the rain of fire swept across them. Animals far removed from the blast zone found themselves surrounded by wildfires. Smoke choked the air, flames leapt from treetop to treetop, and whole landscapes burned at once. Some scientists believe that nearly every forest on Earth caught fire in those hours, leaving behind a planet smothered in ash. The heat itself was enough to kill. The atmosphere, superheated by the returning debris, baked the surface. Temperatures soared for hours, roasting creatures in the open. Only those sheltered underground, in water or in deep burrows, had a chance. Even then, survival was not guaranteed. Streams dried, soil baked, and oxygen dwindled in enclosed spaces. Survival came down to luck, location, and sheer resilience. And yet, even in this horror, not everything perished at once. Crocodiles in rivers, shielded by water, clung on. Mammals in burrows pressed deeper into the soil, huddling in darkness. Seeds buried in the ground remained intact, waiting. Insects, especially those that could feed on decaying matter, thrived in the chaos. But for the towering dinosaurs, the ones that had ruled the world so long, this was the beginning of their end. The impact did not kill them all instantly, but it set in motion a chain of disasters that would erase them. After the first hours, the sky darkened. The dust and soot thrown up by the impact began to spread. Sunlight dimmed to a sickly twilight. Photosynthesis stopped. Plants withered, starving the herbivores that fed on them. With fewer herbivores, the predators soon followed. The food chains that had supported vast ecosystems collapsed like dominoes. In the oceans, plankton died off, breaking the base of the marine food web. Creatures that had thrived in the seas for millions of years suddenly found themselves in barren waters. Think of how strange the world must have felt then. For millions of years it had been noisy with life, filled with the footsteps of giants, the buzzing of insects, the calls of birds, the rustling of leaves. Now it was quiet. The great forests had burned to ash. The skies were dark. The air was colder. Those who survived did so in silence, scurrying, hiding, feeding on scraps. The world had changed overnight, and though some creatures endured, the age of dinosaurs was slipping away. The rock that fell from the sky did not just scar Earth's surface, it rewrote the story of life itself. Without that impact, dinosaurs might still rule today. Mammals might still be tiny, furtive creatures hiding in shadows. The asteroid ended one age and opened the door for another. From the silence that followed, new voices would rise. But in those first days, all that mattered was survival. The day the sky fell was not the end of the world entirely, but it was the end of the world as it had been known, and as the fires smouldered, as the dust spread higher, the true aftermath was only beginning. The planet did not rest after the impact. The rock that had torn into the Yucatan had left more than a scar in the crust. It had unleashed fire across continents. Even as the crater cooled, even as molten rock settled back into silence, the rest of the Earth burned. Forests that had stretched unbroken for thousands of miles were suddenly sheets of flame. What had once been green and shaded and alive was now black and orange, crackling, collapsing, sending sparks into the already darkened sky. The rain of molten debris that had circled the globe returned in waves, each fragment like a tiny meteor igniting the air as it fell. Entire landscapes caught fire at once. There was no single wildfire to run from. The air itself was hot enough to set leaves smouldering, to ignite dry grass without a flame ever touching it. Even creatures that fled to rivers and lakes found themselves surrounded by steam as water boiled and oxygen grew scarce. Imagine what it must have been like for those who survived the first blast. A hadrosaur, perhaps, wandering the edge of a forest miles from the impact site. Its skin shivered as the ground quaked. Its ears caught the low rumble from far away. Then the sky brightened. Not with sunlight, but with a sickly glow, and minutes later, the forest around it lit like a torch. Instinct drove it to run, but where could it go? Every direction carried the smell of smoke. Every gust of wind carried sparks. Creatures that had lived their entire lives under the shelter of trees now faced the collapse of their only home. The firestorm was global. Studies of ancient charcoal in sediments tell us that plants across the world burned almost at once. The heat radiating back down from re-entering debris raised ground temperatures enough to ignite anything that could burn. Grasslands, forests, even damp swamps dried and flared. It wasn't only the land. Out at sea, floating mats of vegetation went up in smoke, releasing clouds that mixed with the dust already hanging in the sky. Fish swam in waters now shadowed by soot, their surface littered with falling ash. And yet, amid this destruction, survival still depended on chance. Some places escaped the worst of the fires. In deep valleys, rivers shielded patches of green. In wetlands, soggy ground slowed the flames. In caves, darkness provided refuge. Small mammals huddled underground, their tiny bodies pressed together for warmth as the surface world collapsed. Insects burrowed into the soil or hid beneath bark. Seeds lay dormant in the ground, sealed away from the searing heat. It was not mercy, but randomness that decided who lived and who died. For weeks the fires raged. Their smoke thickened the atmosphere, turning daylight into a dim glow. Ash fell like black snow, coating rivers and lakes, suffocating fish and insects alike. Rain mixed with soot to fall as dark sludge, staining everything it touched. The earth's smell was acrid, heavy with the scent of burning wood, sulphur and decay. Creatures that had escaped flame still struggled with the poisoned air, coughing in ways we can only imagine, struggling for breath in an atmosphere thick with death. When the fires finally began to die, the world that remained was unrecognisable. Charcoal lay where forests had been, rivers were clogged with debris, grasslands were stripped bare. Entire regions were silent, no birds calling, no insect buzzing, no animals moving through undergrowth that no longer existed. Even the soil was changed, scorched to sterility in places, unable to support regrowth until time and rain could heal it. The global firestorm was not just a side effect of the asteroid, it was the first chapter of the longer extinction. By stripping away vegetation, it left herbivores starving. By darkening the sky, it cut off photosynthesis. By filling the atmosphere with soot, it prepared the planet for its long winter. The fire was both an end and a beginning, a passage into the deeper catastrophe of darkness and cold that followed. Think of the sheer scale of it. Today, a wildfire that sweeps through a forest is devastating enough. A single fire can last weeks, can send smoke across entire regions, can choke cities hundreds of miles away. Multiply that by 1,000, by 10,000, and stretch it across every continent, and you begin to approach what Earth experienced then. There was nowhere untouched, no horizon that did not glow red, no air free of smoke. The entire biosphere became one vast furnace, and still, life persisted in corners. Crocodiles sank deeper into rivers, their armoured bodies enduring heat that would have killed other creatures. Turtles buried themselves in mud. Amphibians clung to moist refuges where flames could not reach. Mammals gnawed whatever roots they could find, their teeth cracking open the hard shells of seeds. Even some birds, descended from small feathered dinosaurs, managed to survive by feeding on the few scraps that remained. Each survivor carried forward a spark, not of fire but of continuity. Each was a thread in the fabric of life that refused to unravel completely. When the smoke finally began to thin, when the fires burned out and the ash settled, Earth entered a silence deeper than before. The flames had consumed more than forests. They had consumed stability. What followed was a planet stripped bare, ready for the next calamity, the long winter of darkness. But before that silence fully arrived, before the dust settled into its thickest blanket, the memory of fire lingered in every corner of the globe. Charcoal buried in soil, blackened trunks standing like monuments, air still heavy with the scent of smoke. For those who lived, it was not only the memory of flame, but the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. And so the world, scorched and trembling, turned slowly toward its next trial. When the asteroid struck, the world shuddered in ways no living creature had ever experienced. The impact itself was a moment of unimaginable violence, but the story did not end with fire and falling debris. The Earth is not a silent partner in catastrophe. It responds, it groans, it shifts, it sends out ripples that race across continents and seas. Those ripples were not gentle. They were shock waves, and they carried destruction far beyond the blazing crater. The rock had slammed into shallow water, blasting a cavity more than 100 miles wide. The crust beneath it buckled, fractured, and heaved upward before collapsing inward again. That movement alone released enough seismic energy to rival the largest earthquakes in Earth's history, magnitudes that make the strongest modern quakes seem like aftershocks. If you've ever felt the ground tremble beneath you during a small quake, you know how unsettling it feels. Now imagine that sensation amplified beyond comprehension, not for seconds, but for hours, rolling outward, shaking mountains, rattling valleys, and stirring the seas into chaos. Around the Gulf of Mexico, the ground would have convulsed violently, splitting open, hurling debris, sending cliffs crashing into the water. Forests already scorched by falling fire found their roots torn loose by waves of trembling earth. Rivers sloshed back and forth in their channels, spilling over banks, flooding plains, then draining back in sudden surges. Animals that had managed to survive the fires stumbled in confusion as the very ground beneath them betrayed their balance. Those too close to the epicenter never had a chance. They were swallowed by collapsing cliffs, crushed beneath falling rocks, drowned in sudden floods. But the shock did not stop there. Seismic waves radiated outward through the crust, circling the entire planet. Within minutes, quakes shook lands thousands of kilometers away. In what is now North America, entire forests quivered, trees toppling like matchsticks. Across the Atlantic, waves of vibration rattled the coasts of Africa and Europe. Even on the far side of the world, the tremors arrived, weaker but still unsettling, as if the planet itself were groaning from the blow it had just endured. In the oceans, the consequences were even more dramatic. The sudden displacement of water triggered tsunamis taller than skyscrapers. Waves hundreds of meters high surged outward from the Gulf, racing across the seas faster than a jet plane. Coastal regions thousands of kilometers away found themselves swallowed hours later, when walls of water arrived without warning. Imagine being a creature on a shoreline half a world away. Perhaps a group of pterosaurs perched on a rocky cliff, scanning the horizon for fish. Hours after the sky had burned, the sea itself rose up, a wall of water blotting out the horizon, smashing against rock and carrying everything away. Whole ecosystems vanished beneath those waves. Estuaries, mangroves, beaches, all scoured clean in a single sweep. The tsunamis carried evidence of their reach. Today, geologists find deposits of disturbed sediments far inland, layers of rock and sand thrown out of place by waves that had no business reaching so far. In Texas, in Florida, in regions once distant from the crater itself, traces of ancient tsunami debris mark the scale of the ocean's fury. The impact did not just scar one region, it reshaped coastlines across the globe. As the seismic energy continued to ripple, aftershocks shook the planet for weeks. Fault lines slipped. Volcanoes may have stirred, their chambers disturbed by the sudden jolt. Geysers erupted, releasing steam into already darkened skies. The earth groaned under the strain, releasing its anger in fits and starts long after the initial blow. Creatures that had managed to find shelter from fire found no peace in the days that followed. The ground refused to hold still. For the dinosaurs, creatures accustomed to stable ground beneath their heavy bodies, the quakes must have been terrifying. Imagine a massive sauropod, one of the long-necked giants, swaying as the ground rolled beneath it, its legs struggling to balance on soil that shifted like water. For smaller animals, the tremors were no less dangerous. Burrows collapsed, trapping mammals that had sought refuge underground. Birds nesting in cliffs saw their perches crumble. Crocodiles in rivers were swept away as banks collapsed. Survival was no longer about strength or speed. It was about luck, about being in the right place at the right time when the earth decided to convulse again. And yet, amid this destruction, there were survivors. Life is stubborn, unwilling to yield entirely. Some burrows held firm, some cliffs resisted collapse. Some valleys absorbed the waves instead of amplifying them, and in these pockets small creatures endured, though their world was altered forever. The shock waves were more than physical, they were environmental. The quakes and tsunamis stirred up sediments from the ocean floor, releasing carbon dioxide, methane and other gases. Toxic chemicals entered rivers and lakes. Ash mixed with water to form acidic slurries that killed fish and plants alike. Entire freshwater ecosystems collapsed as lakes turned poisonous, streams clogged, and wetlands drowned. For creatures that depended on clean water, this was another lethal blow. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the silence that followed each quake. Imagine standing in a charred forest, smoke still rising, the air still thick with heat, and then feeling the ground tremble. Trees groan, rocks fall, animals cry out. Then, after minutes of chaos, the shaking stops. For a moment, all is still, eerily still, as though the world is holding its breath, waiting for the next convulsion. And then, just as you begin to think it is safe, another aftershock arrives, rolling through the ground, reminding you that stability has vanished. That cycle of tension and release must have defined the days and weeks after the impact. The fossil record bears witness to this turmoil. In rock layers from that time, scientists find deposits of jumbled sediments, signs of sudden underwater slides, and chaotic layering consistent with repeated earthquakes and waves. In some places, fossilized fish lie entombed in silt that buried them alive, caught as waves swept them inland and then retreated. In others, marine shells are found far above where they should be, carried by tsunamis to heights they could never reach on their own. These are not quiet deposits of gradual change. They are the fingerprints of catastrophe, written in stone. For humans, living millions of years later, it is hard to grasp what global shaking would feel like. The strongest recorded earthquake in modern times reached a magnitude of about 9.5. The Chicxulub impact may have released seismic energy equivalent to a magnitude 11 or 12, something far beyond anything in our experience. Buildings would not just crumble, entire landscapes would rearrange themselves. And though no human eyes witnessed it, the scars remain in the rocks, silent reminders of the day the Earth convulsed. The shock waves also played a role in shaping the crater itself. When the asteroid struck, it created a temporary cavity far larger than the final crater. The ground rebounded upward, forming a central peak that then collapsed outward, leaving a ringed structure. This complex crater design, familiar from other impact sites but on a far greater scale, was the direct result of seismic energy moving through the crust. Today, the buried remains of those rings can still be detected beneath the Yucatan, a frozen memory of the planet's moment of upheaval. As days passed and the quakes gradually lessened, the Earth began to settle, but the damage was done. The crust had shifted, coastlines had been redrawn, ecosystems had been erased, and above it all, the skies remained dark, filled with dust and ash, the sun hidden behind a veil of destruction. The shock waves had done more than shake the ground. They had shaken the foundation of life itself, ensuring that even in places far from the crater, no creature could escape the consequences of that single terrible day. And still, this was not the end. The fires had burned, the shockwaves had rolled, but the dust was only beginning to show its power. The Earth was heading into a night that would last not hours or days, but years. The shock had passed, but the darkness was still to come. The shaking finally eased, though aftershocks still rolled across the continents and the oceans continued to slosh with unnatural tides. The fires that had swept across forests and plains burned themselves into embers, leaving behind blackened landscapes that once had been green and alive. And in that strange silence after the convulsions and flames, the planet began to breathe in something new, something heavier, something that would change the course of the catastrophe more than the impact itself. It was the ash, the soot, the fine dust that had been blasted into the sky by the force of the collision. If the firestorm had been a scream, this was the suffocating whisper that followed, spreading slowly, evenly, until the whole world was wrapped in it. When the asteroid hit, it pulverized billions of tons of the rock, flinging them upward at speeds high enough to launch fragments into space. Most of it fell back, re-entering the atmosphere as glowing meteors that set forests ablaze, but a fraction remained suspended high above in the stratosphere. Mixed with this dust was soot from the burning of countless trees and plants, droplets of sulphur released from vaporized gypsum, and fine particles of glass called spherules formed when rock was melted and sprayed out as tiny molten beads. Together, they formed a cloud that encircled the globe, blotting out the sun. At first, the change in light might have seemed subtle to any creature still alive. Days dimmed, shadows softened, sunsets lengthened. But soon the dimming grew heavier. What had once been daylight began to resemble dusk. Plants that reached for the sun found themselves starved of light. Leaves turned pale, stems sagged. Flowers failed to open. And as days turned to weeks, the twilight deepened into something worse, something close to night. Across the entire planet, from pole to equator, the sun was veiled, and the earth slipped into darkness. The air itself became strange. Breathing was no longer the same act it had been before. Ash fell slowly, coating the ground, the water, the leaves of plants that still clung to life. Each inhale carried grit, fine particles that scratched throats and lungs. Insects clogged their spiracles. Fish gasped at water thickened with soot, and larger creatures coughed as their airways filled. Rain, when it came, was no relief. The sulphur mixed with water to fall as acid, burning leaves, stinging skin, poisoning rivers. Lakes that had once supported fish and amphibians became sour, killing what little remained. For the survivors, the darkness was more dangerous than the flames had ever been. Fire was immediate, but ash was patient. It lingered, it spread. It seeped into every crack, every nest, every burrow. It did not roar like fire or rumble like quakes. It fell softly, relentlessly, until the surface of the planet wore a coat of grey. Fossil layers today still bear this mark. A thin but unmistakable band of clay, enriched with iridium, a metal rare on Earth, but common in asteroids. That line, found in rocks around the globe, is the fingerprint of the ash. It is the signature of the catastrophe written in stone. But in those first days and months, no creature cared for signatures. What mattered was survival. The absence of sunlight meant the collapse of photosynthesis, the very engine of ecosystems. Without light, plants died. Without plants, herbivores starved. Without herbivores, predators followed. The chain unravelled quickly. Insects that fed on decaying matter thrived for a while, but even they began to falter as the supply dwindled. The oceans too dimmed. Phytoplankton, the microscopic plants that float at the surface of the seas, could not survive without light. As they died, so did the zooplankton that fed on them, and so on up the chain until fish, marine reptiles, and the great mosasaurs found themselves in barren waters. Imagine standing in that world. You walk through a forest that is no longer green but black and grey, the trunks of trees stripped of leaves, the ground soft with ash instead of grass. The sky above is not blue but a dim heavy grey, without a sun to guide you. The air smells of sulphur, sharp and choking. You cannot see the horizon clearly because the haze dulls every distance, and in the silence there are no birds calling, no insects buzzing, no rustle of leaves in the wind, only the soft fall of ash like snow that never melts. The cooling began almost immediately. With sunlight blocked, temperatures dropped. Days grew colder, nights colder still. Regions that had been warm turned chill, and those already cold became unlivable. Ice spread at the poles. Frost coated the ash in temperate regions. Tropical climates shrank. Animals adapted to warmth found themselves shivering, their bodies unable to cope with the sudden change. Amphibians froze in ponds. Reptiles slowed and stiffened. Even mammals, with their fur and higher metabolisms, struggled in burrows and nests that grew colder each day. The Earth had entered what scientists call an impact winter, a period of cold darkness that lasted for years. But it was not only temperature and light that changed. The chemistry of the atmosphere shifted. Sulfur aerosols reflected sunlight, deepening the chill. Carbon dioxide released from burning forests lingered, waiting to warm the planet once the dust cleared. But for the moment the cooling dominated. Ozone was stripped away, leaving survivors exposed to ultraviolet radiation. Whenever the sun did manage to pierce the haze, the balance of gases in the air was disrupted, a subtle poison that made every breath uncertain. Life clung on where it could. In the deep ocean near hydrothermal vents, communities of strange creatures survived untouched by sunlight. Tube worms, clams and bacteria continued their odd existence, oblivious to the surface catastrophe. Underground, seeds endured, waiting for the daylight would return. Mammals in burrows rationed their energy, feeding on roots and insects. Crocodiles sank deeper into rivers, their cold-blooded bodies slowing to near stillness. And high above, a few lineages of small, hardy birds adapted to feed on seeds, and insects managed to persist, carrying forward the legacy of their dinosaur ancestors. The ash, though devastating, was not infinite. Slowly, gradually it began to settle. Particles fell into oceans, forming layers that would one day tell geologists the story of that time. Dust drifted into soil, changing its chemistry, making it more acidic. Some of it washed away in rain, collecting in low valleys and swamps. But for years, enough remained in the atmosphere to keep the skies dim, the temperatures cold and the ecosystems in collapse. Even after light began to return, the scars remained. Forests regrew slowly, starting from seeds that had survived underground. Grasses pushed through the ash, their green blades startling against the grey. Insects repopulated, feeding on the first sprouts. Mammals ventured from their burrows more often, sniffing cautiously at the new shoots. But the great age of dinosaurs was over. Their massive bodies required too much food, too much energy, and in the years of darkness there was none to spare. They dwindled, then disappeared, leaving behind only their smaller bird relatives to carry their name into the future. The ash had done its work. It had stripped the world bare, reset the stage, silenced the giants, and left space for something new to emerge. It is strange to think that without those years of grey skies, without the patience of that long winter, mammals might never have risen. Our story, the story of humans, was written in the fallout of that ash. Every step you take on soil today carries particles of that ancient catastrophe. Every layer of rock beneath your feet holds whispers of that time, and still, if you close your eyes, you can almost picture it. The dim world, the endless twilight, the soft fall of ash that muffled every sound. The earth wrapped in a blanket not of comfort but of silence. A silence so heavy that even millions of years later it leaves its trace in the stones we study, in the bones we find, in the memories of a planet that once drowned in its own sky. The fires had faded to embers, the ground had stopped convulsing with its worst shocks, and the waves that had swallowed coastlines eventually lost their fury. But the world was far from recovery. The ash that drifted down from the sky was only part of the story. The real transformation began when the atmosphere itself thickened into a veil so dense that the sun disappeared. It was not just dim twilight anymore, it was night. Not the ordinary night that ends with dawn, but a night that lingered, heavy and suffocating for months that stretched into years. This was the longest night Earth had ever known. Imagine waking each day to the same darkness. The sun, if it showed itself at all, was no more than a pale disk, blurred and feeble, its rays scattered by soot and sulphur drifting high in the stratosphere. Daylight looked like dusk, and dusk looked like the edge of total blackness. For plants, it was death. Without light, photosynthesis stopped. Trees that had survived the fires starved, their leaves wilting and falling until branches were bare. Grasses failed to sprout, flowers remained closed, forests stood silent and skeletal. The green fabric of the earth unravelled in weeks. For the creatures that depended on plants, the change was swift and merciless. Herbivorous dinosaurs wandered through landscapes stripped of food. Their great bodies, built for constant grazing, found nothing to sustain them. The smaller among them tried to dig for roots, to strip bark from trees, to chew whatever scraps remained. But it was not enough. They weakened quickly, their ribs showing, their movements slowing. Predators that had relied on their abundance followed close behind, first feeding on the sick and dying, then finding fewer and fewer meals until hunger claimed them too. The giant world of dinosaurs, once so unstoppable, collapsed under the weight of hunger. Insects fared no better at first. Those that had fed on flowers found no blooms to visit. Those that had lived on leaves starved alongside their hosts. But scavengers, those that thrived on decay, found themselves in temporary abundance. As bodies fell, as forests withered, as life itself faltered, carrion feeders grew fat. Beetles, flies, and tiny worms multiplied in the soil, feeding on the collapse. They became one of the few engines still running in the ecosystem, breaking down the dead into nutrients that would one day matter again. Though in that moment it seemed pointless, as if the earth were composting itself in vain. The oceans too darkened. With light blocked from reaching the surface, phytoplankton died in massive numbers. These microscopic plants were the foundation of marine life, and as they vanished, so did the zooplankton that fed on them, and so on up the chain. Fish that had filled the seas swam in barren waters. Ammonites, coiled-shelled creatures that had thrived for hundreds of millions of years, vanished entirely. The great marine reptiles, mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, starved soon after. Even coral reefs, those ancient architects of the sea, bleached and crumbled in the dark cold. The temperature of the planet fell. Without sunlight, warmth drained away. Average global temperatures dropped by more than 10 degrees Celsius, and in some places by much more. Regions that had been lush and warm froze. Snow fell in areas that had not seen it in millions of years. Lakes froze over, rivers slowed, frost spread across ash-covered plains. Animals that had depended on warmth to regulate their bodies stiffened in the chill. Cold-blooded reptiles faltered. Amphibians, already sensitive to changes, disappeared in many places. Only those with ways to keep themselves warm, mammals with fur, birds with feathers, had a better chance, though even they struggled against the unrelenting scarcity of food. To survive in this longest night, creatures turned inward. Mammals curled together in burrows, conserving heat and energy. They gnawed on roots, seeds, and insects, living lean and small. Some may have entered states like hibernation, slowing their metabolisms to endure stretches of famine. Birds clung to seeds, the one form of plant life that endured in the dark, their strong beaks cracking open shells to reach the last stores of nutrients. Crocodiles slipped into deeper waters, slowing their bodies almost to stillness, surviving on the reserves in their muscles and the occasional meal that floated their way. Life shrank, hid and waited. But waiting was not easy. The night stretched on. Scientists today estimate that the skies remained dark for at least a year and a half, maybe longer. That might sound short, but to a creature living day to day, it was an eternity. Generations of small animals lived and died without ever seeing a true sunrise. Whole lineages vanished in that span. Plants that could not store energy in roots or seeds perished entirely. Forests thinned into graveyards of standing trunks. Ecosystems collapsed so thoroughly that when light finally returned, the survivors were strangers in their own lands. The psychological effect, if we dare to imagine it, must have been overwhelming. Animals are not philosophers, but they are aware of cycles. They know the rhythm of day and night, of seasons, of warmth and cold. To live in a world where dawn never truly came must have been bewildering, The cues that guided migration, breeding, feeding, all were gone. Birds that once navigated by the sun had no guide. Plants that once flowered by seasonal light cues never bloomed. The entire calendar of life was erased. We can see echoes of this in fossils. Growth rings in fossilized bones of survivors show stress, a record of famine and slow development. Shells of surviving clams show chemical signatures of colder waters. Layers of sediment from lakes record sudden die-offs of algae and fish. Every record we uncover tells the same story, a world where time itself seemed to pause, locked in a night that refused to end. It's easy to think of extinction as a single event, a sudden catastrophe that wipes life away in a moment. But the truth is slower and crueler. The impact itself was the spark, the firestorm, the first blow, the shockwaves, the second, the ash, the third. And then came the longest night, the lingering cold famine that sealed the fate of species that had survived the first onslaughts. Dinosaurs did not vanish in a day. They dwindled across years, each sunrise dimmer than the last, each season colder, each generation smaller, until finally they were gone. And yet, even in this grim span, life did not give up. Seeds endured, burrowing mammals carried on, birds clung to the hard bounty of seeds, insects adapted to feed on decay. In the deep oceans, near volcanic vents where light was never needed, communities thrived as if nothing had changed. These small bastions of survival were the threads that kept the tapestry of life from unravelling completely. The longest night was not the end of Earth's story. It was the beginning of a new one, though no creature living in that darkness could have known it. For humans today, it is difficult to imagine such darkness. The closest we come is during volcanic eruptions, when ash clouds dim the skies for weeks or months. In 1815, the eruption of Mount Tambora caused what became known as the Year Without a Summer, plunging much of the world into crop failure and famine. That event lasted a single year, with temperatures dropping only a few degrees. Multiply that effect many times over, extend it for years, and you glimpse the scale of the impact winter. The longest night left its mark not only in rocks, but in the trajectory of life. It cleared the stage, ruthlessly, for mammals to expand when light returned. It forced survivors to adapt to scarcity, to cold, to unpredictability. And when the sun finally did return, it revealed a world that no longer belonged to giants, but to the small, the adaptable, the resilient. So the night did end, though not quickly, not gently. Light crept back slowly, timid at first, then stronger. Plants sprouted again from seeds that had waited. Insects followed, then the animals that fed on them. Forests slowly stitched themselves back together. The earth turned from black to green again. But the memory of that night remained. It is written in every mammal that learned to hide, every bird that learned to crack seeds, every ecosystem that rebuilt from almost nothing. And perhaps, in some strange way, the memory lingers even in us. For we are children of that night, descendants of the creatures that endured it, shaped by its silence and its scarcity. Without it, there would be no mammals in the forms we know, no humans to look back and tell the story. The longest night was not just a tragedy. It was a turning point, a reset, a doorway from one age to another, and as Earth spun on, carrying its scars and its survivors, the ash continued to fall, the air continued to clear, and the sun prepared to return. But before that light could bring renewal, there were still more trials ahead. For the oceans, for the climate, and for the fragile survivors who had made it this far into the dark. The darkness did not lift quickly. Even as the ash began its long fall through the air and the sulphur haze thinned in patches, the heat that once wrapped the planet had already bled away. The fires had used up enormous amounts of oxygen, the soot had blocked most of the sunlight, and the atmosphere now wore a film of particles that scattered and reflected what little light filtered in. The result was not only dim days, but a steady drop in temperature that pressed into every corner of the world. The ground released its stored warmth night after night, lakes lost heat to cold skies, and winds carried chill across burned plains and empty coasts. What had begun as a sky problem became a ground problem, and then a water problem, and then a problem for blood and bone. It was not just dark anymore. It was cold. This cold did not arrive like a winter storm with a clear start and a predictable end. It crept. A week that felt merely brisk turned into a month of frost, and then a season where ice lingered after midday. Places that had known mild nights found thin films of ice at dawn. Ponds sealed over. Shallow marshes stiffened. Rivers grew sluggish at the edges, then locked in place in quiet reaches. The cooling touched everything that exchanged heat with air or water. Cold-blooded animals fell silent first, their bodies no longer able to keep pace with need. Reptiles that had basked on warm banks in the Cretaceous sun became statues in the dimness. Amphibians that had hidden under damp leaves found those leaves brittle and frozen. Even insects slowed, their movements turning jerky and spare, their life cycles interrupted. Plants carried the cold differently. After the light failed, photosynthesis stopped, but many species still retained the machinery of life in their roots and stems, holding out for a break in the dimness. The temperature drop forced a second failure. Cells that had been stressed by hunger now contended with ice crystals. Some species had proteins and sugars that helped bind water and reduce freezing damage, but many did not. Needles browned, broad leaves blackened, and in the burned landscapes where ash sat in a thin, insulating layer, the soil below chilled fast and deep. Seeds, however, told a different story. Encased, dry, and often buried, they endured. The cold made them wait longer. Waiting was not the enemy for a seed. It was a strategy. In the oceans, cooling was immediate at the surface. Sunlight had already been blocked by soot and dust, so the topmost layers lost heat to the air without replenishment from above. Winds stirred these layers, mixing cold water downward. The upper ocean became dense and heavy, sinking in places and driving up deeper water that was colder still. This overturning rearranged the chemistry of entire basins. Nutrients that had been locked below came up, but the phytoplankton that would normally seize that bounty lacked the light to use it. Dead organisms from the first crash settled into deeper water and decomposed, using up oxygen in the process. Zones of low oxygen spread. Fish, already starving with the collapse of plankton, found their gills pulling water that held less and less of what they needed. At coastlines scoured by tsunamis, the near-shore waters filled with sediments and plant debris, dark as tea, sharp with acids leached from the ash. Cooling made these near-shore waters slow to mix, turning some inlets into cold, still traps. On land, the chill rewrote behaviour. Mammals that had used the cover of darkness to forage for insects and fallen fruit were now living in a permanent night with added frost. They compressed their lives into shorter, cautious ventures from shelter, using stored fat and the warmth of clustered bodies to bridge the longer gaps between meals. Small size helped. What had kept them hidden under the rule of dinosaurs now let them fit into cracks, tunnels, and burrows that held pockets of bearable heat. Fur mattered. Dense undercoats trapped thin layers of warm air against skin. Oils kept damp out. Teeth mattered too. Seeds and roots were tough food in the best of times, but in the cold they became lifelines, and jaws built to gnaw could turn a buried cache into a winter's worth of calories. Birds found advantage in mobility, but mobility demanded energy, and energy was scarce. Those that ate seeds had an edge. Their beaks could split husks, and their guts could pull useful sugars from dry stores that had survived in soil and in the hollows of fire-blackened trunks. Those that depended on insects chased dwindling swarms by day and searched bark and leaf litter by night for larvae. Feathers, with their unmatched insulation, kept core temperatures in range, but the bill came due in the form of higher food needs. Many lineages would not have met that bill. The ones that did kept moving, scouring wider areas, sometimes taking to coastlines where cold winds were hardest, but tide lines still yielded scraps. The cold touched the chemistry of the atmosphere in ways that were not visible, but were consequential. Sulfur aerosols continued to reflect sunlight and encourage the formation of more cloud droplets, brightening clouds and keeping more of the sun's energy from reaching the ground. With fires largely out, soot production fell, but the particles already aloft persisted, especially those small enough to ride the stratospheric winds for years. Ozone damage left gaps that would later matter when light returned, exposing surviving plants and animals to hard ultraviolet. But during the deepest part of the cooling, the main issue was simple. The daily flow of energy into the system had been throttled. Ground that cooled quickly emitted less water vapour, and with less vapour came fewer and weaker storms in some regions. In others, moisture flowing over newly cold surfaces condensed and fell as snow, sometimes in places that had not seen snow in tens of millions of years. Snow cover, bright and reflective, returned even more sunlight to space, reinforcing the chill. After fires, many hillsides had lost their plant cover, and when the ground froze and then thawed, it heaved and slumped. With each freeze, water in the soil expanded, pushing stones and roots upward. With each partial thaw, the loosened surface slid. Small mammals found their burrow ceilings dropping onto their backs and dug them out again. Reptiles that had used shallow burrows were forced lower, seeking layers that did not wrench and buckle with each temperature cycle. Predators that remained, including small theropods that would not make it much farther, tested new behaviours. A scavenger in cold times spends more energy searching and less energy digesting. The math becomes unforgiving. Those that succeeded learned to find the leeward sides of ridges where snow accumulated less, to watch the edges of frozen lakes where fish sometimes came too close to the underside of the ice, to patrol the margins of fire-killed forests where fallen trunks trapped drifted leaves and the insects beneath them. The cold created patterns, and those patterns were maps for feeding, breathing and sheltering, but only for the few that could read them. There were refuges. Geothermal areas, rare but real, offered thawed ground, warm water and a stable microclimate. Edges of volcanic fields and places where groundwater rose, warm gave frogs and insects a toehold. Caves held steady temperatures compared to the surface. South-facing slopes in the mid-latitudes caught what little slanted light there was, and stayed a degree or two warmer than flats and north faces. Along coasts, tidal pools that retained even a hint of geothermal warmth, or that exchanged with the sea in complex ways, avoided the hardest freezes. These refuges could not support the living mass that the world had carried before, but they gathered the survivors into concentrated pockets, where interactions continued and lineages persisted. Every cold season on a normal planet forces a pause, a redistribution, and a rhythm of scarcity and renewal. This stretch of cold did not have spring at the ready. The responses were improvisations stretched thin. Growth slowed in the bones of animals. Lines in teeth recorded days of poor nutrition. Shells laid down by clams and snails showed abrupt changes in isotopes consistent with cooler water and altered chemistry. In lake mud and shallow sea sediments, black layers revealed times when oxygen had gone missing from bottom waters, while coarse layers held the wreckage of storm surges and ice shove. The Earth kept all the receipts. As the years of dimness wore on, the initial cause of cooling began to change. Fires had injected carbon dioxide into the air on a massive scale, and volcanic outgassing in the years after the impact added more. In an ordinary climate, that would push temperatures upward. But as long as the high atmosphere still held reflective aerosols, the greenhouse signal was muted. When the particles finally began to clear in a decisive way, the system did not smoothly return to the prior state. It wobbled. Regions with new snow cover remained bright and cold longer. Oceans that had turned over and reorganized circulation did not snap back to earlier patterns. Currents took new paths, and those paths set different coastlines under different regimes of upwelling and downwelling. The first years after the deepest part of the cold were not simply a warm-up, they were a shuffle. For land animals that had made it through the worst, the gradual easing of the cold created opportunities but also risks. Warmer spells encouraged movement and breeding, but a late freeze could still kill exposed eggs and strip the thin food stores that had barely recovered. Many mammals likely had shorter generations in this period, with small bodies that reached reproductive age quickly, and strategies that emphasised having more young rather than investing in a few. Flexibility beat specialisation. A generalist diet that included seeds, roots, carrion and insects could ride out a patchy landscape of cold pockets and warmer corridors better than a narrow menu tied to a vanished plant or a now rare prey. Plants began to reappear first as low, fast-growing forms that could exploit even brief windows of acceptable conditions. Grasses, already a presence by the late Cretaceous, were well positioned to spread on soil scoured by fire and freeze. Their growth points sat low, protected from grazing and cold snaps. Ferns, often early colonisers after disturbance, painted swathes of ground with new green when moisture and temperature allowed. Shrubs followed where roots could get purchase in soil that had been reorganised by frost heave and erosion. Trees returned slowly, first as pioneers that tolerated harsh light and wind once the sky brightened, then as communities that could knit together a canopy again. Until then, the openness of the landscape favoured animals that preferred edges and mosaics rather than deep forest. The cold's legacy lived on in bodies and behaviours long after the worst months passed. Fur density in mammalian descendants tells a story of ancestors for whom warmth was survival, not comfort. The ability to lower metabolic rate, whether full hibernation or shallow torpor, offered extra lives during periods when the temperature dropped hard and food ran out. Quiching became a profitable skill. Seeds carried to burrows in better moments kept meat on bones in the lean ones. Burrow architecture itself likely improved, with chambers placed at depth that stayed out of the frost's reach, and entrances angled to break wind. Social clustering would have an advantage where shared heat saved calories. Even in birds, many modern behaviours, huddling, communal roosts, synchronised foraging, have echoes that make sense when traced back to ancestors that met long cold nights with only a little food in their crops. Rivers taught lessons too. In the cold, ice formed along banks and reached out from shore, creating under-ice channels where water still moved. Fish took shelter there if oxygen allowed. Mammals learned that these margins were dangerous but rewarding places. Dangerous because thin ice could break, rewarding because weakened fish could be reached through cracks and gaps. When thaw pulses came, ice raft had pushed sediment into new bars and flooded back channels that had been dry. Animals that tracked these small openings found food earlier than those that waited for a full seasonal shift. In the seas, the first recovery was patchy. Where light returned enough to reach the surface, blooms of plankton came in bursts, sometimes large enough to deplete the remaining nutrients and crash again. Cold water species spread where warmth had retreated. Warm water species that somehow persisted were bottled in shrinking belts near the equator. The rearranged food webs favoured opportunists that could feed on a mix of resources, including the steady rain of organic particles from dead and dying organisms above. Scavenging became a central function in both ocean and land ecosystems, knitting the system together when primary production was intermittent. Cold, by itself, is a blunt tool. What made this episode decisive was the timing and the stacking of stresses. Light loss starved the base of the web. Fire destroyed cover and seed banks. Waves stripped coasts. Quakes broke the ground. Then the cold took what remained of momentum out of every living process that depended on steady input. The sequence mattered. If cold had come first with bright skies, many plants and animals could have braced. If darkness had come without cold, some might have scraped by on stored heat and delayed growth. Together, They squeezed options until only the most adaptable, the best sheltered, and the luckiest moved forward. It is tempting to cast this as an ordeal endured only by small things while large ones failed, but size alone did not seal fate. A small creature with a narrow diet and a need for steady warmth was in as much trouble as a large grazer without grass. A large-bodied crocodile with a slow metabolism, access to water that did not freeze solid, and the ability to go weeks without a meal was better positioned than a small specialist that needed nectar from flowers that no longer opened. Cold, blurred categories. The traits that carried weight were the ones that lowered the daily cost of being alive and that multiplied the ways to find calories when the landscape offered only meagre choices. As the cold years stretched on, the memory of the warm green Cretaceous faded from the surface. The physical traces remained, stumps charred by the first fires, trunks toppled and preserved in sediments, dunes of ash locked under thin snow, but the daily experience of those who lived was now set by the new climate. Air stung when breathed too deeply, water taken by mouth-leached heat from tongues and throats. Sound travelled differently over frozen ground, sharper and farther on quiet nights, muffled when snow fell again. Predators used those acoustics. Prey learned to listen through the hush. The eventual easing did not erase the cold's imprint. When light improved and plants stirred, the first growth had to navigate soils altered by repeated freeze-thaw, by acid rains from earlier months, and by the rearrangements pushed by storms under a different circulation. That meant patchwork recovery, with some slopes greening while adjacent hollows stayed barren. Animals tracked the green up like a tide line. Those with enough range to relocate followed it. Those bound to small areas rose or fell with the luck of their patch. There is a hard clarity to cold that shapes choices even for species that did not exist yet. Later lineages would carry forward fat storage strategies, seasonal coats, habits of shelter, and flexible feeding grounded in this long trial. The cold did not simply kill, it sorted. It winnowed a global inventory of forms down to the ones that knew how to run lean, hide well, and wait. In places where ice grew thick on lakes, spring thaws, when they finally came, broke up with cracking sounds that echoed across kilometres. Shorelines collapsed under the shove. Channels cut by moving ice created new paths for water, and eventually for migrating animals. Fish populations snapped back in erratic pulses. Some years, fry from a lucky hatch found nutrients and light aligned, and a cohort survived. Other years, a late cold snap iced over spawning beds and ended a run before it began. That variability favoured species that spread risk by spawning more widely and more often, and it disfavoured species tied to a narrow window. The air itself learned new rhythms. With less vegetation to slow winds, gusts scraped across open ground, lifting dust and ash again, and sending low, dirty clouds down valleys. Those winds cut heat from skin and fur, increasing the cost of any activity above ground. The same winds piled snow into drifts that, paradoxically, protected the ground below from deeper freezing. Under those insulating mounds, seeds waited a little warmer, and small mammals tunneled through a stable world only a few centimetres high. Above it looked like a frozen desert. Below it functioned as a cramped but structured neighbourhood. The cold also touched reproduction directly. Eggs that needed stable warmth failed more often. Species that carried young internally had an advantage, as did those that could adjust the timing of breeding to match brief warm intervals. Many lineages likely shifted to smaller clutches and litters more often, trading quantity for the ability to try again sooner if conditions broke bad. Parental care, where it existed, made a larger difference, with warmth and protection from parents compensating for a harsher external world. Those changes were not decisions as we think of them. They were filters, selecting for traits that paid off more under these rules. Even as the cold loosened, the world it left behind looked unfamiliar compared to what had existed before the rock fell. Forest canopies were lower and patchier, Open habitats were more common. Food chains were shorter, with fewer large animals and more steppes built around small, quick lives. The cooling had pruned away many of the long-lived, slow-growing forms and emphasized speed, flexibility, and the efficient conversion of scarce resources into the next generation. That set the stage for everything that followed when warmth and light made generosity possible again. The planet was not moving toward a permanent deep freeze. The radiative balance would tilt back as aerosols fell out and greenhouse gases accumulated, but those years when the cold ruled left marks too deep to ignore. They changed which seeds were in the soil bank, which animals knew how to endure, and which coastlines, rivers and currents were ready to host the next round of growth. When the first true warm seasons finally returned, they met a biosphere made cautious and clever by deprivation. And so the slow turn continued. Ice thinned on lakes that had been braced under its weight. Winds lost some of their bite as plants began to roughen the ground again. The air regained a little softness. The same survivors that had tunnelled, clustered, and rationed now began to explore farther from shelter. Cold still visited often, but it no longer defined every hour. In the spaces the cold had carved out, new patterns began to write themselves, pointing toward a different world than the one the dinosaurs had known. The chill had done its work. What came next would depend on how the light returned and how the first greens spread back over the black and grey. For more than 150 million years, the dinosaurs had been the ruling presence on land. They were not just another group of animals. They were the backbone of entire ecosystems, the largest bodies moving across the earth, shaping landscapes by their sheer numbers and appetites. Their footsteps were thunder, their shadows long, their presence inescapable. From the long-necked titans that reached into the treetops to the horned herds that thundered across plains, from predators with jaws that could crush bone to feathered hunters no larger than a hawk, they filled every role available to them. They were the giants, and they lived as if nothing could challenge their dominance. But the rock that fell from the sky rewrote those rules, and in the dark, frozen years that followed, their strength became their downfall. It is important to understand that extinction is rarely instant. When we say the dinosaurs died out, it is tempting to picture them collapsing in unison, the entire world falling silent at once. The truth was slower, crueler, drawn out across years. When the fires swept the forests and the ash blotted out the sun, the end did not arrive in a single blow. It arrived as hunger, as thirst, as a creeping weakness that hollowed them from within. They were enormous, yes, but that enormity demanded constant food. A sauropod needed hundreds of pounds of vegetation each day to sustain its bulk. A tyrannosaur needed steady prey to fuel the engines of its muscles. When the plants failed, when the herbivores dwindled, when carcasses grew scarce, the giants had no way to shrink their appetites to match the world that was shrinking around them. Picture a hadrosaur herd, once a river of bodies flowing across a fertile plain. They travelled together, their calls echoing in waves, their young tucked within the mass for protection. Now imagine that same herd in the aftermath of the impact. The plain is ash. The river is clogged with debris. The trees are blackened stumps. They move slowly, ribs showing, eyes dull. Their calls no longer waves of strength but ragged cries of confusion. The young stumble. Predators circle, thinner themselves, desperate, striking not for dominance but for survival. Every step forward is heavier, every bite of bark or root insufficient, and day by day the herd dwindles. Predators fared no better. A tyrannosaur's body was a masterpiece of power. Its skull was built for force, its muscles for speed and strength. But power is expensive. Without prey to match its scale, that masterpiece became a liability. A starving tyrannosaur, once the terror of the plains, was reduced to scavenging in the grey forests, fighting smaller hunters over scraps of carrion, risking injury with every confrontation because there would be no healing if the next meal did not come. Some likely turned on their own kind, battles not for territory but for calories. The slow collapse of prey meant that each encounter, each chase, each strike drained more than it returned. The cold sharpened the decline. Dinosaurs were not entirely cold-blooded in the way reptiles are today. Many were likely warm-blooded or close to it, with feathers and high metabolisms. But warm blood brings with it a cost, constant intake of food to fuel the fire. Small birds could stretch their survival by eating seeds, by slowing down, by huddling. Giant dinosaurs could not. Their metabolisms demanded more than the barren world could offer. Even those that tried to endure by migrating found no refuge. The darkness and chill were global. There was no untouched paradise waiting beyond the horizon. In the oceans, giant reptiles faced the same spiral. Mosasaurs, the apex predators of the seas, had thrived on abundant fish and ammonites. But when the plankton at the bottom of the food chain died, the ladder collapsed upward. Fish starved, ammonites disappeared, and soon the mosasaurs followed. Their size, once a mark of supremacy, was an anchor dragging them down into extinction. For pterosaurs, the great flying reptiles of the skies, the story was much the same. They had soared above Cretaceous coasts in vast numbers, some with wingspans wider than small airplanes. They fed on fish, on small animals, on carrion. But fish populations crashed, land animals dwindled, and carrion was soon picked clean. Their fragile bones, perfect for flight but poor for withstanding hardship, mark them as temporary survivors at best. The skies grew emptier as their forms vanished, leaving behind only the smaller, feathered descendants of theropods that we call birds. The collapse of the giants was not only ecological but audible. The earth grew quieter. The trumpeting of hadrosaurs, the roars of tyrannosaurs, the wing beats of pterosaurs, these sounds vanished one by one, replaced by silence. Forests that had once trembled with the passage of sauropods now stood still, ash falling softly where leaves used to rustle. Rivers once churned by crossing herds now slid silently past. The giants left behind emptiness, and that emptiness became the stage on which something new could appear. The fossil record shows us this transition in fragments. In the very last layers of Cretaceous rock, dinosaur bones still appear, though often small, thin, from individuals that likely died young. Above that layer, they vanish. What remains instead are the traces of mammals, of birds, of reptiles like crocodiles and turtles. The giants vanish, and the small endure. This pattern is not accidental. It is the consequence of scale. Large animals need stability, vast food webs, reliable climates. Small animals can bend with instability, survive on scraps, retreat into burrows, wait for better days. When catastrophe strikes, size becomes fragility. It is sobering to realize how close the balance was. If conditions had shifted differently, if some lineages of dinosaurs had managed to persist a little longer, perhaps they might have re-established themselves once the sun returned. Perhaps the age of mammals would never have dawned. But the weight of extinction was too heavy, the night too long, the cold too sharp. The giants, magnificent as they were, could not make it across that gulf. And yet, they did not vanish entirely. Birds carry their legacy. Every sparrow outside your window, every hawk riding the wind, every penguin sliding across ice, every hummingbird hovering by a flower. They are dinosaurs, the descendants of the ones that endured by being small, by eating seeds, by hiding in the cracks of catastrophe. The giants died, but their lineage still sings, still builds nests, still soars. Their voices are softer now, more scattered, but they remain. For the mammals that survived, the disappearance of the giants was opportunity. Suddenly the world was open. Forest floors no longer shook with heavy feet. Plains no longer belonged to herds the size of houses. Skies no longer darkened with the wings of immense pterosaurs. The stage was cleared. What had once been an overshadowed role became the lead, and slowly, cautiously, the mammals began to expand into niches left vacant. It didn't happen overnight. Recovery was slow, tentative, punctuated by setbacks. But the giants were gone, and with them the old order of life was gone as well. The end of the giants is a reminder of fragility. Supremacy does not guarantee survival. Scale does not protect against collapse. For millions of years, the dinosaurs had been unchallenged, their world as stable as any could be. But a single moment, a single impact, shifted the balance, and the very traits that had made them rulers became their undoing. In their absence, life reorganized itself, smaller, more cautious, more adaptable. And from that new order, a very different Earth began to rise. The giants had ruled in daylight, in warmth, in abundance. Their end came in darkness, in cold, in scarcity. And yet, even in their absence, the world did not remain empty. New giants would come, in time, though of different shapes. New rulers would rise, though never again in quite the same form. The age of the dinosaurs was closed, but the story of Earth was far from finished. And so the silence after their passing was not only grief, but potential. From the ashes of their world, from the bones of their fallen bodies, from the spaces they vacated, evolution began to write a new chapter, one that would eventually include us. The giants were gone, but their shadows stretched forward, shaping everything that came after. On land, the giants had fallen silent, and the forest lay blackened and bare. But the oceans had their own catastrophe to endure. If the surface world was cloaked in ash and cold, the seas below responded in ways both immediate and insidious. To an animal living in the Cretaceous ocean, the change was almost as abrupt as the firestorm on land. For millions of years, those waters had been rich and productive, alive with fish, ammonites, giant marine reptiles, and clouds of plankton that fed everything else. The sea had been a kingdom in its own right, vast and generous, but the impact shifted it overnight into something unrecognizable, something strange. When the asteroid struck, the first effect on the water was violence. A blast wave shot through the Gulf of Mexico, vaporizing water instantly, flinging cubic miles into the atmosphere. The crater collapse created tsunamis hundreds of meters tall, racing outward across the seas. Those waves reached distant shores hours later, sweeping away coastlines, dragging forests and soil into the surf, tearing coral reefs from their foundations. The very first stage of the disaster was physical ruin, the kind that could be measured in toppled reefs, drowned deltas, and beaches turned inside out. But even as the waves receded, the ocean was only beginning to change. The ash and soot that dimmed the skies on land also fell onto the seas. At first it formed a thin layer, but rain carried more of it down, mixing it into the surface waters. It blocked light just as it had blocked sunlight on land. For phytoplankton, the microscopic plants at the base of the marine food chain, this was fatal. They could not photosynthesize in darkness. Entire populations collapsed, and with them, the zooplankton that grazed on them, and the fish that fed on zooplankton, and everything that fed on fish. The ladder of life in the oceans was as fragile as it had been on land, and once the first rung broke, the collapse rippled upward. The loss of phytoplankton did more than starve the seas. It altered the very chemistry of the water. Normally, these tiny organisms absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen, helping balance both ocean and atmosphere. Without them, carbon dioxide built up. The oceans absorbed vast amounts of it from the atmosphere, but instead of being processed by life, it dissolved into the water itself, forming carbonic acid. Slowly, subtly, the seas turned more acidic. Creatures with shells made of calcium carbonate, ammonites, clams, corals, some plankton, found their armour weakening, dissolving around them. Whole lineages that had built their survival on shells discovered that their protection had become porous. The chemistry of seawater itself was turning hostile. Dead matter piled up quickly. Fish, plankton, marine reptiles. Many died in vast numbers, their bodies sinking into deeper layers of water. In ordinary times, scavengers and decomposers would recycle this bounty, but the sheer volume overwhelmed them. Bacteria feasting on the dead consumed enormous amounts of oxygen, leaving behind zones of anoxia, water with little or no oxygen at all. These dead zones spread like stains across shallow seas and into deeper basins. Anything that wandered into them suffocated. Fossil layers today show whole schools of fish entombed in silt, their gills flared open, caught in the moment when oxygen vanished. The surface may have looked deceptively calm at times, waves rolling under a dim sky, but below was chaos. Some regions teemed briefly with bacteria that thrived on decay, creating toxic byproducts like hydrogen sulfide. These poisons bubbled upward, making shallow waters deadly. Reefs, once bustling with fish and invertebrates, collapsed into silence. Corals bleached and died, leaving behind skeletal frameworks that crumbled without the living animals that built them. Whole ecosystems that had taken millions of years to assemble unravelled in weeks. And yet, the ocean was not empty. Survivors endured, though often in unexpected forms. Crocodiles that had ranged into brackish waters clung to survival in rivers and estuaries. Turtles, with their hardy shells and flexible diets, weathered the storm better than many others. Sharks, those eternal opportunists, found ways to persist, though their numbers shrank drastically. Tiny plankton species, some adapted to low light or to feeding on detritus rather than photosynthesis, slipped through the bottleneck. The ocean was strange, yes, but it was not dead. Imagine drifting in a boat above those waters if humans had been there to see it. The surface would have seemed dull, grey under the dim sky, but the smell rising from it would have been wrong. The tang of salt would be mixed with the stench of rot and sulphur, this sign of the death accumulating below. Birds, those few small survivors, might have skimmed the surface in search of scraps, but the great flocks of pterosaurs that once dove into schools of fish were gone. The silence above matched the emptiness below. The strangeness of the oceans did not fade quickly. The darkness lingered, and with it the lack of photosynthesis. Even when light began to filter back, recovery was uneven. Some regions, flushed by upwelling currents, bloomed briefly with new plankton growth, but these blooms were unstable, collapsing almost as soon as they began. Without stable food webs, larger creatures could not return in force. The ammonites, so successful for so long, never recovered. Coral reefs rebuilt only in fragments. Entire families of marine reptiles were gone for good. The ocean had been reset, its former richness stripped away. When scientists study this period today, they find signs of the strangeness in chemical traces. Layers of clay enriched with iridium, the asteroid's fingerprint, sit above sediments marked by sudden changes in carbon isotopes, evidence of disrupted cycles of carbon and oxygen. Fossil shells show pits and etching, scars of acidified seas. Black shales record anoxic conditions, the handwriting of dead zones that spread like bruises across the world's waters. These records are not abstract, they are the testimony of an ocean in shock. And yet, from that shock, new forms would rise. Tiny plankton species that endured became the ancestors of modern groups. Sharks, though diminished, adapted and diversified again. Turtles spread into niches left vacant by the collapse of marine reptiles. Birds that hunted fish became the new aerial predators above the waves. Slowly, the ocean stitched together new patterns of life, though they bore little resemblance to what had been before. It is unsettling to think how fragile the oceans are, even though they seem vast and eternal. A single event, a single impact, was enough to unravel them completely. Their recovery took millions of years, but without that unravelling, the seas we know today with their modern reefs, their shoals of bony fish, their whales and dolphins, would not exist. The strangeness of the oceans after the impact was the crucible in which new futures were forged. The ocean turned strange not in silence, but in transition. It was not the end, though it must have felt like it to the creatures drowning in darkness and poison. It was a passage, a reshaping, a clearing of the slate, and when light returned, it revealed waters no longer ruled by ammonites or mosasaurs, but ready for something new, something waiting in the wings of evolution. The giants had fallen, the seas had turned strange, and the earth itself seemed broken open by the weight of disaster. But amid the silence, amid the endless night and the cold that followed, life did not end. It bent, it shrank, it retreated into corners, into shadows, into places overlooked by the ruins sweeping above. The survivors of this long catastrophe were not the lords of the world, not the towering dinosaurs or the monstrous reptiles of the seas. They were small, they were fragile seeming, but in their smallness lay resilience, and in their resilience lay the seeds of the future. These tiny survivors, unnoticed in the grandeur of the Cretaceous, carried the story of life forward. Picture the world then. The forests are gone, burned to black sticks and buried under ash. The plains are barren, the rivers clogged, the oceans dim and sour. But dig into the soil and you will find burrows, twisting tunnels carved by mammals that had lived in secrecy for millions of years. These creatures were no larger than modern rats or shrews. They scurried at night to avoid predators, ate insects, seeds, roots, anything they could fit in their mouths. Their lives had been small because they had to be, because the dinosaurs had ruled the open spaces in the daylight hours. But when the asteroid fell and the dinosaurs faltered, the smallness of these mammals became their shield. A small body needs less food. A burrow provides shelter from fire, from cold, from predators. A flexible diet, roots, insects, carrion, seeds, offers options when one source of food vanishes. Where a hadrosaur needed tons of plants each season, a mammal could make do with scraps. Where a tyrannosaur needed vast hunting grounds, a mammal could survive in a single valley. The catastrophe was a storm, but storms spare those who are hidden deep enough. These mammals, blind to the idea of their own destiny, endured simply because they were built for obscurity. Seeds played a critical role. In the darkness of the impact winter, plants could not grow, but their seeds, sealed in tough shells, persisted in the soil. Mammals cracked them open with sharp teeth, drawing on the energy stored for future generations of plants. Birds did the same, especially those that had already evolved to specialize in seeds. Crops of grain did not exist then, but nature's storehouses were scattered everywhere. Cones, nuts, seed pods buried in ash. Each seed that was eaten was a life saved, a meal that carried a body one day closer to the slow return of the light. Insects too became lifelines. Many species perished in the fires and cold, but detritivores, those that fed on decay, thrived in the abundance of dead matter. Beetles laid eggs in carcasses, larvae wriggled through rotting plants, flies multiplied where bodies fell. For mammals, lizards, and birds, these swarms were food, squirming packets of energy drawn from the collapse itself. Insects are often overlooked in stories of survival, but in that time they were the gears still turning when all else had ceased. They broke down the dead and recycled nutrients, keeping ecosystems from stalling completely, and they fed the survivors who waited out the night. Reptiles as a group fared poorly compared to mammals and birds, but some held on. Crocodiles, for example, endured in rivers and lakes. Their bodies are built for patience. They can slow their metabolism, surviving long stretches without food. They hide in water that buffers against both heat and cold. They eat almost anything, fish, carrion, even each other if pressed. When the world collapsed, crocodiles did not need much to persist. They simply waited, half buried in mud, their eyes and nostrils above the surface while chaos raged around them. Turtles did the same. Their shells protected them. Their slow metabolisms bought them time, and their flexibility with diet carried them through. Amphibians too clung on, though unevenly. Frogs, salamanders and their kin survived best where water remained liquid, where streams trickled beneath ice, or where geothermal warmth kept ponds from freezing solid. They ate insects, detritus, algae, whatever remained. Their small size and quick reproductive cycles gave them a chance to rebuild quickly once conditions improved. Birds, the true surviving dinosaurs, were among the most important of the tiny survivors. Not all birds made it. The toothed birds, those that still resembled their larger dinosaur ancestors, perished. But the lineages that could eat seeds and insects persisted. Small bodies, feathers for insulation, the ability to fly to find scarce food. All of these traits combined to give them a fragile but real edge. From those survivors came every bird we know today, from sparrows to eagles, from penguins to parrots. Their songs, millions of years later, are echoes of the resilience that carried them through the darkest of times. In the oceans, survival was harder. The collapse of plankton chains wiped out whole groups, but some small creatures endured. Tiny plankton species with unusual metabolisms managed to feed on detritus instead of light. Small fish and crustaceans that could eat anything, detritus, bacteria, tiny survivors, hung on in isolated patches. Sharks, with their efficient bodies and opportunistic diets, survived in diminished numbers. Turtles again bridged the gap, their shells drifting through seas that no longer welcomed the giants. What all these survivors shared was not strength in the sense of power, but strength in the sense of adaptability. They were generalists. They could hide. They could wait. They could make do with little. In a stable, abundant world, specialists thrive. Dinosaurs that eat only one kind of plant. Marine reptiles that chase only one kind of prey. In catastrophe, specialists collapse. It is the generalists, the small, the patient who inherit what remains. Imagine walking through that world if you could. The silence is heavy. The towering forms are gone. The forests are stumps. The seas are empty of great shapes. But beneath the soil, in cracks, in rivers, in nests, there is movement. A mammal scurries from its burrow to chew a root. A bird pecks at seeds in the ash. A crocodile slides silently through a stream. A beetle crawls over a carcass, its mandibles busy. The earth looks dead, but it is not. It is holding its breath, and its breath is carried by the tiny. The fossil record preserves this truth. The iridium-rich clay that marks the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene holds fragments of these survivors. Tiny teeth of mammals, fragile bones of early birds, shells of turtles, scales of crocodiles, impressions of insects. Above that layer, the great bones vanish, but these small traces multiply. They are the bridge across extinction, the evidence that life did not stop, only shifted its centre of gravity. And from these survivors the future opened. Mammals, no longer constrained by giants, began to grow, to spread, to experiment with new forms. Birds diversified into the skies once filled by pterosaurs. Crocodiles and turtles continued their slow persistence, unchanged in many ways because what worked in catastrophe continued to work afterward. Insects flourished in the renewal of plants. Each group carried forward traits that had been proven in the crucible of disaster. It is humbling to realize that our own story begins here, with these tiny survivors. Without them, there would be no mammals to evolve into primates, no primates to evolve into humans. Without them, the world would have been reset into something entirely different, perhaps dominated by reptiles that endured, or by strange survivors we cannot even imagine. Every breath we take is linked to the teeth of those tiny shrew-like mammals, to the feathers of those seed-eating birds, to the patience of those crocodiles in muddy rivers. They endured, and so we exist. The giants ruled with spectacle, but it was the hidden, the overlooked, the tiny that ensured life continued. In the end, survival was not about being the strongest or the most fearsome. It was about fitting through the narrowest cracks of fate. The mammals in their burrows, the birds cracking seeds, the beetles in the carcasses, they slipped through, carrying life's story across the abyss. And when the light returned, slowly, painfully, these tiny survivors emerged into a world empty of giants but full of opportunity. They were small, yes, but they were alive, and that was enough. The Earth was not silent only in its animals. The impact, the fires, the darkness and the cold had also reached into the green fabric of the planet. Forests had burned to skeletons, plains had emptied, and the very engine of life, photosynthesis, had gone quiet. Plants, which had painted the Earth with colour for hundreds of millions of years, seemed to vanish almost overnight. Their stems withered, their leaves turned brittle, their flowers never opened. But plants are not only what we see above the ground. Beneath the ash and frozen soil, in roots and seeds, something remained. What looked like death was not final. It was waiting. In those first months after the impact, the ash that fell was thick enough to cover entire landscapes. It blanketed valleys, choked rivers, and smothered what few green shoots had survived the fires. Rain mixed with it to form a grey paste clogging the surface. For many plants, this was the end. They had no sunlight, no clear air, no strength left to push through the blanket above them. Whole forests, ancient lineages of trees disappeared in that moment, unable to endure even a season without light. But others had prepared for harsh times long before the asteroid arrived. Seeds, tough and resilient, carried the genetic memory of endurance. Some could remain dormant for months, others for years, waiting for warmth, for water, for even the faintest return of light. Seeds are one of evolution's simplest but most powerful strategies. They are capsules of life, tightly packed with energy and instructions, designed to survive the uncertainty of the world. In the Cretaceous, plants had already perfected this strategy. Conifers dropped cones filled with seeds built to endure cold winters and hungry animals. Flowering plants scattered pods and nuts, some armoured against fire and frost, some small enough to disappear into soil and wait unseen. These seeds were the hidden army of life, lying in silence beneath the devastation, waiting for their chance. Roots, too, told a story of patience. Many plants store energy below ground, in tubers, bulbs or thick root systems. Even if their stems and leaves above ground were destroyed, these hidden parts could survive, dormant in the cold, insulated by soil, ready to send up new shoots when conditions improved. It is possible that entire landscapes we thought had been erased carried this underground memory, a storehouse of potential beneath the ash. In the earliest months after the impact, when the skies were dark and the ground frozen, none of this waiting was visible. The earth looked barren. But as the years passed and light slowly began to return, the first green appeared not from new creation, but from the seeds and roots that had endured. Scientists find this story written in fossilized pollen. At the boundary layer that marks the impact, pollen grains suddenly vanish, evidence of plants wiped away. But just above that layer, new pollen appears, first from ferns, then from conifers, then from flowering plants. This fern spike, as paleontologists call it, is the signature of resilience. Ferns, whose spores are tiny and hardy, were often the first to recolonize after catastrophe. They painted the earth in green again, thin and fragile but undeniable. The return of plants was uneven. In some places, ferns dominated for decades, carpeting ash fields in low greenery. In others, shrubs and grasses pushed through first, taking advantage of disturbed soils. Trees returned slowly, their seeds needing more time, more stability, more depth to take root. But once they did, the forests began to reassemble themselves, though in new shapes. Entire lineages of trees that had flourished before the impact never returned. Others, once minor players, seized the empty niches and spread. Recovery was not simply regrowth, it was reshaping. Imagine walking across one of these early recovering landscapes. The ground is grey and broken, but here and there small patches of green catch your eye. Ferns unfurling, their fronds delicate and bright against the ash. Shrubs pushing upward with stubborn shoots. Grasses waving in thin clusters. The air still smells of sulphur and dampness, but it carries a hint of green now, faint but real. Birds flit among the patches, feeding on seeds. Mammals scurry to nibble shoots. Insects crawl over the first flowers. Slowly, a new rhythm begins. The patience of plants was more than a story of seeds and roots. It was a story of strategy. Some species had always lived in cycles of fire and flood, evolving the ability to bounce back after disturbance. In the chaos after the asteroid, these species had the advantage. Ferns, with their quick reproductive cycles and hardy spores, spread first. Grasses, with their low growth points protected from grazing and cold, flourished where forests had once stood. Shrubs and small trees grew where the soil had been scoured. Over time, larger trees followed, shading the ground, creating habitats for other life. The forests of the Paleogene, the epoch that followed the Cretaceous, were not copies of the old. They were mosaics, shaped by the waiting of plants and the absence of those that had not endured. The waiting was not passive. Seeds had chemical defences to deter animals, hard coats to resist decay, mechanisms to sense light and moisture. Roots had energy reserves stored in starches and sugars. Plants had prepared for hardship without knowing it, and when the world collapsed, these preparations became salvation. The Earth's green mantle shrank to its hidden parts, but it did not vanish. And when life returned above ground, it changed the world again. Plants do not simply decorate landscapes, they create them. Their roots hold soil in place, their leaves shape the water cycle, their bodies fuel herbivores. When plants reappeared, even in small patches, they drew animals back. Insects returned to feed on leaves and pollen. Birds followed the seeds, mammals gnawed the roots, reptiles basked in the thin shade. Each green shoot was not only survival for itself, but a beacon that called others to return. In time, forests grew again, though different than before. Palm trees spread in warm regions, deciduous trees expanded into new spaces. Flowering plants diversified, experimenting with forms that would one day produce fruits, nuts, and flowers we recognize today. These plants carried the memory of waiting in their strategies: fast growth, tough seeds, flexible reproduction. Their patience had shaped their resilience, and their resilience shaped the recovery of life. Without the plants that waited, there would have been no animals to follow. No seeds for birds, no roots for mammals, no leaves for insects, no forests to shelter new ecosystems. The world might have remained barren far longer, its recovery stalled. But because seeds lay hidden, because roots clung to life, the green returned. It may have been fragile at first, patchy and strange, but it was enough. It was the beginning of renewal. Even today, you can see the legacy of that patience. When forests burn in wildfires, ferns are often the first to return, sprouting from spores that had waited in the soil. After volcanic eruptions bury landscapes in ash, grasses and shrubs appear within years. Seeds endure in soil banks, waiting decades for the right conditions. The strategies that carried plants through the asteroid catastrophe are the same ones that let them recover from disasters now. They are quiet, but they are powerful. The animals that survived the extinction carried forward the gifts of these plants. Birds evolved to specialize on seeds, fruits, and nectar. Mammals developed diets tied to the new flowering plants, shaping the rise of primates and eventually humans. The entire trajectory of life was redirected by the patience of plants. The green shoots that pushed through the ash were not only survivors, they were architects of the new Earth. And so, while the story of the asteroid is often told as the end of the dinosaurs, it is also the story of seeds, roots, and spores that refused to die. The plants that waited in silence beneath the ash ensured that life would not end in darkness. They gave the survivors food, shelter, and a foundation to build upon. They turned devastation into renewal. The world that emerged from their patience was not the same as the one that had been lost. It was younger, stranger, more open to experimentation. It carried the scars of the catastrophe, but also the promise of diversity. The plants that waited did not just endure, they shaped everything that came after. The giants were gone, their bones settling into ash and mud, their shadows fading from a world that no longer belonged to them. The forests had begun to stitch themselves back together, cautious green pushing through grey soil, ferns unfurling, grasses stretching, shrubs reclaiming the empty spaces. Birds flitted above, insects buzzed again, rivers carried life in their currents. In the silence that followed the catastrophe, new voices were waiting to be heard. Among the creatures that had hidden in burrows, that had scurried underfoot, that had survived on seeds and insects, there was a lineage ready to take its turn. Small, unnoticed, insignificant in the age of dinosaurs, the mammals were about to step out of the shadows. The age of mammals had begun. For more than 150 million years, mammals had been minor players. They had shared the earth with dinosaurs, but never as equals. Most were small, no bigger than rodents, darting in the undergrowth, living by night, avoiding the giants who ruled the open land by day. Their diets were humble: insects, seeds, roots, eggs. Their lives were hidden: burrows, nests, cracks in rocks. They were clever in their obscurity, but the world had not offered them the chance to grow larger, to expand into new forms. Every niche was filled, every space taken by reptiles more massive and dominant. Mammals waited, and then the asteroid struck, and everything changed. In the aftermath, size became a burden. Specialization became a trap. What had once made the dinosaurs strong now condemned them to extinction. What had made mammals overlooked, their small size, their generalist diets, their tendency to hide, became the very traits that allowed them to survive. And survival, in that dark world, was everything. The earliest mammals to emerge into the Paleogene were tiny compared to what we imagine when we think of later beasts. Most weighed no more than a pound or two. Some were insect eaters, their sharp teeth slicing through beetles and larvae that still swarmed in the rotting landscapes. Others were seed crackers, their jaws powerful enough to break into the hardened stores of plants that had waited through the darkness. A few were omnivores, willing to try anything: roots, carrion, eggs, even each other if the famine grew too dire. In these years, adaptability was not a luxury. It was the line between life and death. Fossils tell us that mammals diversified quickly after the extinction. In the layers above the iridium-rich clay that marks the impact, their remains multiply. Teeth, in particular, are found in abundance. Mammal teeth are distinctive, each shape adapted to a kind of diet. The record shows a sudden burst of variety: sharp cusps for slicing insects, flat surfaces for grinding plants, mixed patterns for omnivory. This explosion of dental forms is the fossil signature of opportunity. With dinosaurs gone, food webs collapsed and then rebuilt, and mammals seized the open niches. At first, the changes were subtle. Mammals grew slightly larger, spreading into sizes that had been dangerous when predators like raptors and tyrannosaurs still hunted the land. They began to climb more, to swim more, to dig deeper, to explore new ways of living. Within a few 100,000 years, a blink in geological terms, the mammal world was far more diverse than it had ever been under the shadow of dinosaurs. The key to their success was flexibility. A mammal's body is not fixed to the environment in the same way a reptile's is. Warm-blooded, fur-covered mammals could regulate their own temperature, endure the cold nights of the impact winter, survive in climates that would have killed reptiles. Their young were nurtured with milk, a portable food source that protected infants when external supplies were scarce. Their brains, larger for their size than those of most reptiles, allowed them to learn, to adapt, to experiment with new behaviours. All of these traits, insignificant when dinosaurs filled the world, became decisive when catastrophe reset the game. Imagine a landscape 10 years after the impact. The air is still dimmer than before, though light has begun to return. The forests are patchy, dominated by ferns and shrubs, with young trees just beginning to rise. Across the ground, mammals scurry, some no larger than mice, others the size of small cats. They dig for roots, climb for seeds, chase beetles in the leaf litter. Their calls and rustles fill the silence left by the dinosaurs. For the first time, they are not background noise, they are the main story. As centuries passed, mammals continued to grow. Some lineages stretched upward into larger forms, testing the boundaries of size once again. Herbivores expanded into rabbit-sized, then deer-sized, then eventually into beasts as large as rhinos. Carnivores followed, sharpening their teeth for bigger prey. In the oceans, too, mammals appeared. Small land dwellers began venturing into water, hunting fish, beginning the journey that would one day create whales and dolphins. Every direction life could explore, mammals explored. The extinction had cleared the board, and mammals were quick to play the game, but this rise was not immediate domination. The world was still harsh, still recovering. Climate swings persisted, food webs were unstable, ecosystems fragile. Many mammal lineages that tried to expand failed. For every success there were extinctions. The survivors of the survivors were those that balanced ambition with caution, that could adapt to sudden setbacks. They were the ones who carried forward. The story of the mammals after the impact is one of filling space. Dinosaurs had filled every role from towering herbivore to top predator. With them gone, the roles were empty. Mammals became grazers, browsers, hunters, scavengers, climbers, swimmers, burrowers. Their bodies shifted quickly to match. Some developed long legs for running across open ground, others developed strong claws for digging. Some lengthened their snouts and sharpened their teeth for hunting, while others broadened their molars for grinding plants. Evolution accelerated in the absence of competition, and in just a few million years the Earth looked entirely different. This was the beginning of the Cenozoic era, the age of mammals. It was not a sudden reign like the dinosaurs had enjoyed, but a gradual expansion, a spreading of influence from the shadows into every open niche. The mammals were not giants yet. That would come later, with creatures like the mammoths and the whales. But the foundation was laid in those first fragile centuries, when survival meant small bodies, quick lives, and endless adaptability. The mammals were not alone, of course. Birds flourished in the skies, inheriting much of the ecological space once ruled by pterosaurs. Crocodiles and turtles remained in the rivers, reminders of an older age. But it was the mammals who took centre stage on land, for the first time in Earth's history. Their endurance through the catastrophe, their ability to hide and wait, had given them the key to a kingdom they had never been allowed to claim. Now, step by step, they began to unlock its doors. From these beginnings, everything followed. The rise of primates, the spread of ungulates, the emergence of predators with saber teeth, the return of giants in new forms. The mammals that scurried through ash fields and fern patches after the asteroid could not have imagined what their descendants would become. They only did what all survivors do. They endured, they ate, they bred. But in doing so, they reshaped the Earth. The age of mammals did not begin with grandeur. It began with tiny creatures living on scraps, peering out from burrows into a wounded world. But in their quiet persistence was the promise of a new story, one that would carry life forward into forms unimagined. The dinosaurs had ruled with spectacle. The mammals would rise with subtlety, and in time, that subtlety would prove just as powerful. The age of mammals had begun, and the Earth would never be the same. The Earth had been wrapped in shadow for so long that darkness itself seemed permanent. The fires that once raged had burned out. The cold had settled deep. The seas had turned sour and strange. For years, the sky had been a ceiling of ash and sulphur, blotting out the sun, reducing midday to dusk and dusk to near night. But no shroud lasts forever. Bit by bit, the particles that had been hurled into the upper atmosphere began to drift downward. Rain pulled them from the sky. Snow buried them. Winds carried them into the oceans. The sulphur aerosols that had reflected sunlight back into space began to dissipate. Slowly, too slowly for any one creature to notice in its brief life, the skies began to clear. The change did not arrive as a sunrise that lit the world all at once. It came in fits and starts. One season might have been dim and cold, with grey days barely distinguishable from night. Then, suddenly, for a few weeks, the clouds might thin, and a faint golden light would fall through. Plants that had been waiting underground sensed it and pushed tentative shoots upward, only to be smothered when the next wave of haze rolled back. It was an uneven rhythm, a stuttering return of light. For creatures that depended on cycles, it must have been bewildering. Birds stirred with the hint of dawn, only to find dusk returning within days. Mammals ventured further from burrows during brighter spells, only to retreat again when the cold crept back. Life moved in cautious steps, testing the sky each time it seemed to change. Scientists studying this period find evidence of these fluctuations in the chemical record. Sediments laid down year after year show alternating layers, some darker and richer in carbon from times of gloom, some lighter with signs of more photosynthesis when the light broke through. The world was not recovering in a smooth arc, but in waves, like a patient struggling through a long illness. The skies were clearing, but they were reluctant, as if the planet itself was unsure how to move forward. For plants, the return of light was both salvation and risk. Seeds that had waited for years sensed the signals of warmth and moisture. Ferns sprouted in carpets. Grasses stretched upward. Shrubs put out their first tentative leaves. But every return of light was followed by cold snaps, acid rains, and lingering toxins in the soil. Many shoots failed, yet enough survived to spread spores, to scatter seeds, to take the next step. Slowly, vegetation patched the land again. Green no longer belonged only to memory. It was rising back into reality, fragile but persistent. The animals followed. Insects returned first in numbers, feeding on the new greenery, pollinating the early flowers that dared to bloom. Beetles, always opportunists, flourished in the mix of decaying matter and new shoots. Flies swarmed, their larvae wriggling in the moist soil rich with nutrients washed down from the skies. Birds found these insects and fed, their populations rising again. Mammals followed the insects and the seeds, digging, gnawing, nibbling at the new abundance. Each brightening of the sky meant more food, more energy, more young surviving. For the first time in years, the world began to feel alive again. Not as it had before, with the rumble of dinosaurs and the abundance of tropical forests, but alive in a different way, more cautious, quieter, smaller. The skies themselves told the story of that recovery. Where once they'd been a blanket of dark ash, they now began to show texture again. Patches of blue breaking through, clouds forming with more definition, sunsets tinged with true colour rather than the flat grey of soot. Each small shift carried enormous meaning for the creatures below. Imagine standing on a hillside in that time. For years you had seen only haze above you. Now, one morning, you noticed the sun cutting through. Its light is weak, filtered, but warmer than before. Shadows reappear, faint but real. The ground beneath your feet glows with a new softness. Around you, plants stir. The air smells fresher, less of ash and more of soil. Birds call to each other, tentative songs filling a silence that had lasted too long. It is not a full recovery, but it is a promise. The gradual clearing of the skies did more than bring back warmth and light. It reshaped the climate. For years, the cold had dominated, the so-called impact winter gripping the world. But as aerosols fell away, greenhouse gases that had built up from fires and volcanic activity began to assert themselves. Carbon dioxide, released in vast amounts during the burning of forests and the upheaval of the crust, lingered in the atmosphere. Once the reflective particles were gone, this carbon dioxide trapped heat. The planet, which had been shivering under its shroud, began to warm again. The recovery of light came hand in hand with the stirrings of a greenhouse world. This warming did not erase the scars of the cold immediately. Ice and frost remained in many regions, and ecosystems struggled to adjust to the swinging conditions. But the general trend was upward, toward warmth and renewal. Forests spread more confidently, rivers thawed earlier in the year, insects multiplied in greater numbers, mammals grew larger, testing the new abundance. Birds spread into more niches, their wings carrying them farther under clearing skies. The oceans too began to feel the change. With light returning to the surface, phytoplankton bloomed again. Their green and golden cells soaked up sunlight, multiplied, and fed the zooplankton that followed. Fish populations began to rebuild, tentative at first, but then more robust. Sharks and turtles found more to eat. The seas, once strange and poisoned, began to feel familiar again, though they would never return to their exact old state. Whole lineages like the Ammonites were gone for good, but life was filling the emptiness with new forms, seeded by the survivors that had endured. The skies themselves may have seemed restless during this time. Dust storms swept across dry plains where vegetation had not yet returned fully. Acid rains still fell in places, though weaker. Lightning storms rolled over landscapes raw from erosion and regrowth. But within these tempests was energy that fueled the cycles of recovery. Rain carried nutrients into the soil, washed toxins into the oceans where they diluted. Wind spread seeds farther, giving plants a chance to colonize new areas. The same forces that had once destroyed were now turning into forces of renewal. And slowly, steadily, blue became the dominant colour again. The haze thinned, the light grew stronger, and the rhythms of day and night returned to something recognisable. Dawn once again meant brightness, not a dim thickening of grey. Dusk once again painted the horizon in colour, not soot. Creatures that had adapted to years of darkness faced the unfamiliar gift of light, and they adjusted quickly. Photosynthesis surged. Food chains stabilized. The long night was over. The clearing skies did not just mark recovery, they marked transformation. The world beneath them was no longer the Cretaceous. It was something new, shaped by absence, by waiting, by survival, against all odds. The mammals that scurried in the ferns, the birds that cracked seeds, the crocodiles that slid through rivers, all of them looked up at skies that promised a different future. The earth had endured its trial, and the heavens above were the signal that the worst had passed. It is easy to imagine that moment as a sigh of relief, though no creature could have named it. The clearing of the skies was not only the end of darkness, but the beginning of possibility. Light poured down again, and with it came energy, growth, and the chance for life to spread into every empty space. What had been a wounded world began to breathe again, one slow sunrise at a time. The skies had begun to open again, light returning in hesitant beams, warmth spreading unevenly across a world that had almost forgotten it. Ash still clung to valleys and riverbeds, grey dust shifting with every wind, but the ground was no longer silent. Ferns had already painted thin carpets across the devastation, quick colonizers reclaiming what had been lost. Grasses had followed in patches, and shrubs pushed stubbornly through soil that was still raw. The earliest trees were sending up shoots now, small and fragile, but enough to change the feel of the land. Slowly, steadily, forests began to rise again. They did not return as they had been. The Cretaceous forests had been lush, filled with towering conifers and flowering trees that had shaded hadrosaurs and sauropods, had given cover to raptors, had been thundered through by herds of horned dinosaurs. That world was gone. What returned was tentative, patchwork, a mix of pioneers taking advantage of space left open by the catastrophe. In places, thickets of willows and poplars grew quickly, trees that could thrive on disturbed ground and tolerate poor soil. In others, palms spread wide leaves to capture the sunlight, their roots steadying riverbanks stripped bare by tsunamis. Oaks and other flowering trees pushed upward where conditions allowed, their seeds carried by wind, water, and animals that had survived. The new forests were not replicas of what had been lost, but mosaics of renewal. Every shoot that reached into the air carried more than its own life. Forests shape the world around them. They pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, exhaling oxygen in return. They anchor soil with roots, slowing erosion, giving rivers clearer channels. They shade the ground, cooling it, creating microclimates where delicate creatures can live. They provide food in leaves, seeds, fruit, and shelter in branches, bark, and hollows. As the forests rose, life that had been waiting in the margins came flooding back into them. Insects were among the first to return in large numbers. Beetles bored into bark, ants colonized soil beneath roots, butterflies and moths appeared as flowering plants spread. Their buzzing, chewing, and fluttering filled the air with motion again, and with them came birds that fed on insects and spread seeds further. Mammals followed, scurrying through undergrowth, climbing trunks, gnawing seeds and fruit. The return of forests meant not just food, but cover, protection from predators, shelter from weather. What had been an open, exposed world of ash plains and broken stumps began to fold into layers of habitat again. Forest floor, understory, canopy. The rise of forests can be traced in the fossil record through pollen, leaves and wood. Paleobotanists studying sediments from the Paleocene, the epoch immediately following the extinction, find bursts of new pollen types, sudden increases in plant diversity, and evidence of forest canopies thickening within a few million years. Fossil leaves show insect bite marks, proof that food webs were re-establishing themselves. Even in charcoal layers, remnants of the fires that had scoured the land, there are signs of regrowth sprouting almost immediately after the flames had passed. The earth was quick to clothe itself again. Forests did more than provide stability, they provided innovation. Flowering plants, already diverse in the late Cretaceous, expanded rapidly in the Paleocene. Their flowers attracted insects, their fruits fed birds and mammals, their rapid reproductive cycles allowed them to adapt to changing conditions. They were not only survivors but opportunists, and with dinosaurs gone, they flourished in ways they never could before. Fruits became larger and more varied, offering rewards to animals that carried their seeds. Trees experimented with forms, from towering canopies to dense thickets, each shaping the habitats around them. The forests that rose in the wake of catastrophe were laboratories of evolution, constantly experimenting, constantly reshaping. For animals, this meant opportunities. Mammals that had once been confined to small bodies began to explore arboreal life, climbing trees for food and safety. Early primates emerged in these forests, grasping branches, feeding on fruit, developing traits that would eventually shape our own lineage. Birds nested in branches, spread seeds, hunted insects among the leaves. Reptiles took advantage of shaded pools and basking logs. Every level of the forest became a stage for life to diversify. The atmosphere itself responded to the return of forests. As trees grew, they drew down carbon dioxide that had spiked after the impact. They breathed out oxygen, restoring the balance needed by animals with high metabolisms. They increased humidity. their leaves releasing water vapour that gathered into clouds, changing rainfall patterns. The Earth's climate stabilised not only because the skies cleared, but because the forests acted as regulators, turning the raw chaos of sunlight and rain into systems that sustained life. But the forests that rose were fragile, especially at first. Fires could sweep through easily, fueled by dry wood and grasses. Insects could devastate young stands. Floods could drown seedlings, and droughts could wither them. Many attempts at forests failed, yet enough succeeded that, within a few million years, green stretched across continents again. What had been open plains of ash became shaded groves. What had been silence became alive with rustling, chattering, and the hum of countless organisms. Imagine walking into one of these Paleocene forests. The canopy is not yet as tall as the Cretaceous jungles, but it is thick enough to dim the light below. The air is warm, humid, filled with the scent of soil and resin. Ferns crowd the forest floor, shrubs pressing close, vines twist upward in search of sun. Birds dart through shafts of light, mammals scurry in branches, insects buzz in swarms. It is a forest, young and raw, still assembling itself, but it is vibrant. After years of grey and silence, the earth feels alive again. Forests are more than collections of trees. They are time made visible. Each trunk is a record of seasons survived, each ring a story of drought or plenty, each leaf a testament to the balance between light and shadow. The forest that rose after the asteroid carried in them the memory of catastrophe, but they also carried the promise of renewal. They were not the same as before, but they were enough to sustain the animals that had endured, and more than that, they were fertile ground for the future. It is easy to think of the asteroid as the end of the age of dinosaurs, but it was equally the beginning of the age of forests as we know them. Many of the plant lineages that dominate today, oaks, maples, palms, grasses, took root and expanded in this time. Their rise was intertwined with the rise of mammals and birds, each feeding on the other, each shaping the other's evolution. The forests rising from the ash were not just survivors, they were architects of a new earth. And so, step by step, leaf by leaf, root by root, the world was clothed again. The skies had cleared, the soil had steadied, and the forests rose not as echoes of the past, but as the foundation of what was to come. From their shade, the future would emerge, carrying with it the memory of fire and darkness, but also the resilience of green. The forest had returned, the skies had opened, the rivers flowed again, and the silence of catastrophe was replaced by the stirrings of a new age. What followed was not simply recovery, but reinvention. Life had been cut down and remade, and with the giants gone, the small survivors were free to explore possibilities they had never been allowed before. Evolution, which had always been shaping, suddenly found itself with a blank canvas. In the shadow of extinction, new paths began to open, branching in directions that would define the world to come. It is difficult to imagine the freedom of that moment. For more than 150 million years, the ecosystems of Earth had been shaped and constrained by dinosaurs. They were the centerpieces of food webs, the weight that bent every ecological arc around them. Mammals had stayed small because large niches were already filled. Birds had stayed in narrow forms because the skies were dominated by pterosaurs. Plants had evolved under the trampling feet and long necks of sauropods, under the grazing and browsing of herds that reshaped forests. Even insects had followed patterns dictated by the giants, who consumed the plants they pollinated. When the asteroid fell, all of that ended. Entire roles stood empty. Predator, grazer, canopy shaper, seed spreader, all of them had been vacated in a geological instant. It was an ecological silence, and silence begs to be filled. Mammals were the first to step into that silence with visible ambition. In the Paleocene, within a few million years of the impact, they began to diversify at a pace that seems explosive when traced in fossils. Small insect eaters split into lineages that experimented with size and diet. Some grew longer snouts and sharper teeth. testing life as predators. Others flattened their molars, leaning into plants. Still others combined traits, becoming omnivores that could nibble roots one day and insects the next. The range of body sizes stretched, from shrew-sized scurriers to creatures as large as modern dogs and eventually larger. It was not yet the age of mammoths and mastodons, but it was a step away from the age of hiding. Primates took their first recognisable shape in this window. Small tree-dwelling mammals with grasping hands and feet, with forward-facing eyes, began to appear in forests that were thickening again. They fed on fruit and insects, balancing on branches, leaping between trunks. Their brains grew larger relative to their size, their senses sharper. These earliest primates were still tiny, fragile in a world of predators, but they were experiments that would one day lead to monkeys, apes, and eventually humans. That path began here, when the absence of dinosaurs allowed forests to belong to mammals for the first time. Ungulates, the hoofed mammals, also began their story in the Paleocene. At first, they were small, no bigger than cats or foxes, with simple teeth and flexible diets, but the potential for grazing and browsing, for taking advantage of the new flowering plants spreading across the land, pushed them to diversify. Within millions of years, they would branch into the ancestors of deer, horses, camels, and cattle. The path from timid seed-eaters to vast herds thundering across plains began in this experimental window of time when space was open and plants abundant. Predators followed. With herbivores growing, carnivorous mammals began to evolve larger bodies and sharper adaptations. Some lineages developed saber-like teeth, others emphasized speed and pack hunting. They were still small compared to the apex predators of later epochs, but they were already claiming roles that had once belonged to tyrannosaurs and raptors. For the first time, mammals stood at the top of food chains, not as scavengers, but as hunters shaping the behaviour of prey. Birds also branched out in new directions. With the pterosaurs gone, the skies belonged entirely to them. Seed-eating lineages spread rapidly, filling forests with flocks. Waterfowl diversified along rivers and coasts. Predatory birds took to the air, evolving sharp talons and hooked beaks to claim roles once occupied by aerial reptiles. Some birds grew large, flightless, striding across open ground as new giants of the plains. Others remained small and agile, flitting through forests and meadows. The absence of competition allowed birds to explore forms that would define avian life for the rest of time. Plants followed their own evolutionary paths in response. Flowering plants, freed from many of the pressures of dinosaur herbivory, expanded into new forms. Fruits became more varied and colourful, attracting mammals and birds that spread seeds farther than wind or water alone could carry. Trees experimented with structures, creating layered canopies that provided habitats for countless creatures. Grasses, which had already appeared before the extinction, but remained minor players, spread more widely. In time, they would transform entire continents into grasslands, but even in the early Paleocene, they were quietly expanding, laying the groundwork for future ecosystems. Insects responded to these changes as well. With flowering plants diversifying, pollinators multiplied. Bees, butterflies, and beetles evolved alongside the blooms, each shaping the other's trajectory. Other insects adapted to new mammals, becoming parasites, scavengers, or mutualists. The intricate web of plant-insect-animal interactions that defines modern ecosystems took shape in this period of experimentation, each branch of life pushing into new territory because the old order was gone. The oceans too were arenas of new paths. Though devastated, they slowly rebuilt themselves. Sharks persisted, diversifying into new forms to fill predatory niches left open by the extinction of mosasaurs and many large fish. Turtles expanded into marine roles, some growing larger as the seas stabilized. Tiny plankton species, survivors of the darkness, gave rise to modern lineages that still form the base of marine food webs today. Whales did not yet exist, but the mammals that would eventually return to the sea were beginning their evolutionary story on land. The oceans were quieter than before, missing their ammonites and marine reptiles, but their silence was temporary. Evolution was working there too, writing new scripts. What makes this moment remarkable is not just that new paths appeared, but that they appeared so quickly. Catastrophe had reset the board, and evolution responded with speed. In stable ecosystems, change can be slow, hemmed in by competition and entrenched niches. In disrupted ecosystems, where survival alone has opened doors, change accelerates. Lineages that might have remained obscure for millions of years suddenly had room to flourish. Traits that might have been minor advantages became decisive. Evolution thrives on opportunity, and opportunity was everywhere in the aftermath of extinction. It is tempting to view this as progress, as if life were climbing upward toward mammals, toward primates, toward humans. But evolution does not work with goals. It works with possibilities. Each lineage that expanded after the asteroid was not aiming for the future. It was simply surviving, reproducing, exploiting what was available. The fact that some of those paths led to us is a matter of contingency, of chance piled upon chance. Countless other paths were taken and ended, mammal lineages that vanished, bird lineages that died out, plant forms that never spread. The Paleocene was not a straight road, but a branching maze, full of experiments, most of which were temporary. But the ones that lasted defined the world we know. Imagine watching that world unfold. In the forests, primates leap between branches, their hands curling around twigs, their eyes alert. On the ground, small ungulates browse leaves, their hooves clumsy but improving with each generation. In the rivers, turtles bask on logs, while crocodiles slide through the shallows. Overhead, birds call, some colourful, some drab, some flying, some running across the ground. Insects swarm in flowers, pollinating, buzzing, feeding. It is not the world of dinosaurs, not yet the world of humans, but a world in between, alive with possibility. The new evolutionary paths did not erase the memory of what came before. The bones of dinosaurs still lay in the soil. The oceans still bore scars of acidification and dead zones. The forests still carried charcoal from fires. But life is always forward-looking, driven not by memory but by need. Each generation was focused on the next meal, the next nest, the next seed. In that relentless focus on survival, new forms emerged, each one an answer to the question of how to live in a world remade. From these beginnings, the arc of life bent into shapes that define the present. Mammals grew into predators and grazers. Birds claimed every corner of the sky. Flowering plants spread across continents. Insects built intricate relationships with blooms and animals. The oceans stabilized into new systems. The Earth that emerged in the millions of years after the impact was not a wounded version of the Cretaceous. It was a new world entirely, defined by its survivors and their experiments. The asteroid had ended one story, but in doing so it had made room for countless others. Each of those stories branched, some fading quickly, others growing into the dominant forms of life. It was not the end of evolution, nor its beginning, but a moment of acceleration, a turning point when the paths of the future were drawn in new directions. The world would never again be as it had been, and it would never stop changing. Beneath the soil and stone of our world there is a library written not in ink but in bone, leaf, shell, and sediment. It is silent, and it is patient. Every layer of rock, every bed of clay, every seam of shale is a page in that library, holding words that cannot be spoken aloud but can be read by those who know how to listen. The story of the asteroid impact and its aftermath is one of the most dramatic chapters in that library, and yet when we approach it, what strikes us most is not the violence but the quiet. The fossil record does not thunder with the roars of dinosaurs or the crashes of waves. It whispers through fragments, through gaps, through the silence of absence. The fossil record's silent story is what tells us that the Earth was broken and then remade. When paleontologists dig down to the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, they find a thin line, sometimes no thicker than a coin. This layer is consistent around the world, from North America to Europe to Asia to the deepest parts of the ocean floor. It is rich in iridium, a metal rare in Earth's crust but common in asteroids. That iridium line is the fingerprint of catastrophe, the quiet testimony of the rock itself that something unimaginable struck our planet. Above that line, dinosaur bones vanish. Below it, they are abundant. Above that line, ammonites disappear. Below it, their shells are everywhere. The silence of what is missing speaks as loudly as the presence of what is found. The record is not filled with complete skeletons or intact forests frozen in time. More often it is teeth, scattered bones, pollen grains, pieces of charcoal, the faint impressions of leaves pressed into stone. A tooth tells us that a mammal lived here, nibbling at seeds or tearing into insects. A grain of pollen tells us that a forest had begun to return, its spores floating on air currents. Charcoal fragments tell us that fire raged, stripping landscapes bare. Each piece is small, fragile, often overlooked, but together they compose the record of survival and extinction, of endings and beginnings. Silence is just as important. In the layers above the boundary, whole groups vanish. Dinosaurs, except for the line that became birds, leave no further trace. Ammonites, which had ruled the seas for millions of years, are gone. Pterosaurs no longer leave wing bones in the rocks. The absence is overwhelming. You can flip a page in the Earth's library and watch entire worlds disappear. That silence is the story of extinction, written in the starkest possible way. And yet, above the silence, life appears again in new forms. The fossil record shows us mammals multiplying, birds diversifying, plants experimenting with shapes and strategies. The story is not told in a single fossil, but in the accumulation of many, each one a note in a long, slow song. A jawbone here, a seed there, a feather pressed into mud, a turtle shell preserved in silt. These are the fragments that tell us that the world did not end but shifted. What makes the fossil record remarkable is its honesty. It does not dramatize, it does not embellish. It simply preserves what happened, without interpretation, without bias. A tree trunk turned to stone tells us there was once a forest. A ripple in sandstone tells us water once flowed. A sudden absence of shells in a layer tells us the ocean changed. The silence in the record is not emptiness, it is information. It is the clearest sign we have that catastrophe reshaped life. Consider the fern spike. In layers immediately above the iridium boundary, fossil pollen and spores change dramatically. The diverse mix of Cretaceous plants is replaced almost entirely by ferns. This sudden dominance of fern spores is found in multiple locations worldwide. It tells us that ferns, quick colonizers of disturbed ground, surged into the empty landscapes. That record is silent in its way. It does not describe the fires, the ash, the dead forests, but the sudden abundance of fern spores whispers the truth. The earth had been scoured, and only ferns could rise first. The fossil record also captures stress in the bodies of survivors. Fossilized bones of fish show signs of oxygen stress. Their growth rings uneven, their skeletons thin. Mollusks record changes in ocean chemistry, their shells etched and pitted by acidification. Tree rings in fossilized wood reveal years of cold and poor growth. Even the survivors carry scars written into their remains. These are not dramatic stories of struggle told in real time, but quiet records etched into growth patterns, waiting millions of years to be read. The silence of the fossil record is also a reminder of what we cannot know. The vast majority of creatures that lived and died in that time left no trace at all. Soft-bodied animals decayed without fossils. Whole ecosystems of insects, fungi and microorganisms vanished without record. The fossil record is a story told in fragments, and its silence is as vast as its words. Yet even in its gaps it gives us direction, showing us which lineages survived, which vanished, and how the earth shifted in their absence. When paleontologists kneel in the dust and brush away soil from a bone or a leaf impression, they are not just uncovering an object, they are uncovering a voice from silence. Each fossil is a message carried across millions of years saying, "I was here, I lived. This was the shape of the world then." Taken alone, each fossil is small. Together, they are the chorus of Earth's history, a chorus that includes both sound and silence. The fossil record also tells us about speed. Extinctions are sometimes slow, stretched across millennia. But at the boundary, the silence is sudden. Groups vanish at once, globally, in a way that cannot be explained by gradual change. The iridium line, the fern spike, the sudden disappearance of entire families of animals and plants, these all point to a catastrophe sharp enough to change the course of life in what was, geologically speaking, a heartbeat. Without the fossil record's silent testimony, we would never know how quickly the Earth was altered, and yet the record shows recovery too. Within a few 100,000 years, diversity begins to rise again. Mammals are more varied, birds more numerous, plants more experimental. The silence gives way to new voices. Recovery was not instant, but it was relentless. The fossil record does not tell us that life despaired. It tells us that life adapted, always. The silence of extinction is followed by the murmur of renewal, then the rising hum of diversification. Imagine standing at a dig site, holding a fragment of bone that once belonged to a small mammal, scurrying through ferns after the catastrophe. Around you, in the same rock, are fossilized spores, insect impressions, fragments of charred wood. In that single slab is a snapshot of a world remaking itself. The fossil does not speak, but it tells you a story if you know how to listen. That is the silent record, truth without sound, history without words, resilience without proclamation. The story of the asteroid and its aftermath is not one of total destruction, but of transformation, and the fossil record captures both sides. It shows us the end of the giants and the beginning of the small, the silence of extinction and the whisper of survival. It reminds us that history is not just written in triumphs, but in absences, in what is missing as much as what remains. The fossil record's silent story is the reason we know that the Earth was struck, that the skies darkened, that forests burned, that oceans soured, and that from that silence life began again. Every fossil is a sentence, every layer a paragraph, every sequence of rocks a chapter. The silence between them is not emptiness but meaning, the space where worlds ended and new ones began. To read the fossil record is to learn how to listen to silence, and in that silence, to hear the resilience of life echoing across deep time. The story of the asteroid and its aftermath is not only written in fossils. Bones and leaves, shells and teeth tell us who lived and who died, but the rocks themselves tell us how. In crystals, in clay, in minerals laid down in moments of disaster, there are records as precise as any diary. They are not alive, they never breathed, and yet they carry the fingerprints of catastrophe. To understand the impact, scientists have learned to read these clues, to hold crystals up to light, to grind clay into powder, to peer into thin slices of rock through microscopes. Each crystal is a witness, each grain of clay is a page. Together they tell us what it felt like to be a planet struck by fire from the sky. At the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, there is a layer unlike any other. Sometimes it's only a few centimetres thick, sometimes more, but it is always there, a thin band separating two worlds. Within it are tiny glass-like beads called tektites, droplets of rock melted by the heat of the impact and hurled across continents before cooling into perfect spheres. Hold one in your hand and you are holding a piece of Earth that was once liquid in mid-air, blasted from the surface at unimaginable speed. These glassy beads are not guesses or metaphors, they are direct evidence of an explosion that turned solid rock into a rain of molten droplets. Mixed with them are shocked quartz crystals. Under an ordinary microscope, quartz looks simple, clear, unremarkable. But shocked quartz bears scars, microscopic lines etched across its structure, created only when rock is subjected to pressures far greater than any volcanic eruption could produce. These scars are shock lamellae, tiny fractures that align in patterns unique to impacts. They are geological fingerprints, proof that the Earth was struck with a force no earthquake or eruption could match. Finding shocked quartz in boundary layers around the world is like finding shattered glass scattered after an explosion. Each grain says, "Here, something immense happened." Clay in this boundary layer also holds secrets. When the asteroid hit, it released sulfur and other chemicals into the atmosphere. Rain washed them down, mixing with ash and pulverized rock to create unusual clays that stand out sharply from layers above and below. Some contain high concentrations of iridium, the rare metal that first tipped scientists off to the extraterrestrial origin of the disaster. Iridium is common in asteroids, scarce on Earth. Its presence in this global clay layer is the signature of an intruder, a piece of the cosmos embedded forever in Earth's surface. In some places, crystals record the heat itself. Tiny spherules of rock formed not only in the impact crater, but in the atmosphere, as debris vaporized and recondensed into glass. Some of these rained down thousands of miles from the crater, forming layers in places as distant as North America and Europe. In those layers, scientists have found magnetic signatures, traces of how molten droplets aligned with the Earth's magnetic field as they cooled. They froze in place in seconds, but in doing so they captured both the violence of their birth and the quiet stability of the planet that carried them. These minerals and clays also tell us about the fires that followed. Charcoal fragments mixed with crystals show that global wildfires raged almost immediately after the impact. Soot trapped in sediments matches chemical fingerprints of burned forests, proof that landscapes far from the crater went up in flames. The crystals mark the blow, the charcoal marks the aftermath. Both are preserved side by side, silent records of a chain reaction that reshaped the planet. The impact itself left behind not just scattered debris but a crater, the Chicxulub crater, in what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. Beneath layers of younger rock, scientists have drilled into this structure and pulled up cores of shocked rock, melted glass and deformed crystals. These cores are like time capsules, preserving the moment of impact in stone. Some layers show rock melted into pools, then solidified. Others show crystals fractured and reoriented by the force of the blast. Together they describe the seconds and minutes after the asteroid struck, the unimaginable pressures and temperatures that turned bedrock into liquid, then froze it again in new forms. Clay above the impact layer holds yet another kind of clue: microscopic fossils, or the lack of them. In ocean sediments, tiny shells of plankton disappear right at the boundary. The clay itself contains no fossils at all, a gap that marks the sudden collapse of ocean ecosystems. Just above that clay, new plankton species appear, fragile at first, then more diverse. The clay is not only a chemical record but a biological silence, a moment in Earth's history when life itself paused. Even the colour of these layers tells part of the story. Boundary clays are often grey or dark, streaked with soot. They contrast sharply with the lighter, more uniform sediments above and below. To a geologist's eye, this is not just a difference in shade, it is a difference in process. The grey marks disaster, a time of mixing, burning, upheaval. The lighter layers mark stability, years when sediment drifted down slowly, peacefully, unbroken by cataclysm. The thin band of dark clay is the scar across Earth's face, narrow but unmistakable. Crystals and clay are not only relics of the impact itself, but windows into the years that followed. Layers immediately above the boundary contain evidence of acid rain, locked in mineral chemistry. They show unusual sulfur compounds, proof that the atmosphere was saturated with gases that turned rainwater corrosive. Other layers show a drop in calcium carbonate, the mineral that forms shells and reefs, evidence that ocean chemistry had shifted, dissolving what had once been stable. These are not fossils of animals, but fossils of conditions, chemical imprints of a world in crisis. The fossil record tells us who survived. The crystals and clays tell us why. They explain the sudden darkness, the acid oceans, the global fires. They are the hard evidence that turns speculation into certainty. Without them, we might still wonder whether volcanoes alone could have caused the extinction, or whether climate change over millions of years was enough. With them, we can say with confidence, a rock fell from the sky, struck the earth, and left behind these scars in stone. Imagine holding a fragment of shocked quartz, no larger than a grain of sand. To the naked eye, it looks ordinary. But under magnification, the scars within it line up like rungs on a ladder, each one a memory of the unimaginable pressure that tore through it. That single grain has carried its memory for 66 million years, silent until we learned how to read it. Multiply it by the countless grains found across the world, and you have a chorus of witnesses, each one whispering the same truth. Clay and crystals are modest storytellers. They do not roar like a tyrannosaur, or tower like a sauropod, or fill the seas like an ammonite. But in their silence they are precise. They do not exaggerate. They do not forget. They carry records written in heat, in pressure, in chemistry. To understand the end of the Cretaceous, we do not only look at bones, we look at crystals fractured in a second, at clay settled over years of silence, at glass spheres frozen in midair. These are the quiet truths of geology, and they speak with authority. The story they tell is not only of destruction, but of resilience. For above the layer of shocked quartz and tektites, above the soot and charcoal, new crystals form in new sediments. Clays shift back toward normal chemistry. Fossil shells reappear, first in small numbers, then in abundance. The minerals themselves record the recovery, showing how the planet's cycles re-establish themselves. The Earth did not remain in shock forever. Its rocks healed layer by layer, even as life above rebuilt itself leaf by leaf, bone by bone. In this way, crystals and clay are not only records of disaster, but reminders of continuity. The asteroid was a rupture, but the planet endured. The library of stone was scarred, but it kept writing. The same processes that had always laid down sediments, crystallized minerals and weathered rocks continued before, during, and after the impact. The clues are embedded seamlessly into Earth's story, as much a part of it as the fossils of creatures themselves. To hold these clues is to touch the moment of catastrophe directly. A dinosaur bone tells you of a life lost. A fern spore tells you of a plant returning. But a fragment of shocked quartz tells you of the very instant when the Earth was struck. A tektite bead tells you of the fireball that followed. Clay streaked with iridium tells you of the cosmic intruder that brought it all. These are not echoes of lives, but echoes of forces. They are the most direct voices we have from the moment the world changed. The fossils speak softly of who endured. The crystals and clay speak silently of how it all began. Together, they tell the story of the end of one age and the start of another, written not in words but in the textures of stone. The silence of the earth is never empty. It is filled with memory, waiting for someone to listen. Beneath the quiet jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, beneath limestone plains and mangrove swamps, beneath towns and roads and beaches, there is a scar so vast that it cannot be seen from the ground. It lies hidden, buried under layers of younger rock, invisible except to the instruments that measure gravity, magnetism, and the echoes of seismic waves. Yet it is one of the most important scars in Earth's history, for it is the wound left by the asteroid that ended the reign of the dinosaurs. The Chicxulub crater is not simply a hole in the ground, it is a frozen moment of unimaginable violence, preserved in stone, a reminder that the Earth itself remembers what happened even when the living world moves on. 66 million years ago, a rock more than 10 kilometers wide struck the shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico. In seconds, it released more energy than billions of nuclear bombs, vaporizing water, melting rock, and carving a cavity more than 100 kilometers across. The ground rippled like water. Mountains of molten rock rose and collapsed within minutes. A ring of peaks formed inside the crater, taller than any mountain range on the modern Yucatan, then slumped back into place as the Earth struggled to heal its wound. What was once a calm seabed became a cauldron of fire, pressure, and shock. The Chicxulub crater today is buried, its edges softened by time. But geologists have mapped it with precision, tracing its circular outline across the peninsula. Its diameter is about 180 kilometers, making it one of the largest confirmed impact structures on Earth. It is not visible like Arizona's Meteor Crater, not dramatic to the eye. Instead, it is subtle, a gravity anomaly, a faint ring of cenotes, natural sinkholes formed where limestone collapsed into fractures left by the impact. To walk across the Yucatan is to walk across the rim of history without seeing it. But the Earth remembers, even if the surface forgets. Drilling into Chicxulub has revealed the violence of that moment layer by layer. At the top are younger sediments, calm deposits of limestone from millions of years after the impact. Beneath them lies the thin boundary clay, rich in iridium, mixed with soot and glassy spherules. Deeper still are layers of rock shocked by pressures far beyond volcanic or tectonic forces. Some are melted entirely, fused into glass-like breccias. Others are fractured into microscopic lamellae, the scars of shock waves. And at the centre lies the peak ring, a circle of mountains formed in the minutes after impact when the Earth rebounded from the blow and collapsed again. These rocks, now buried and silent, are evidence of the most violent few minutes the Earth has ever endured. The crater scar is not only geological but ecological. Around it, layers of sediment record tsunamis that raced outward, carrying trees, animals and debris deep inland. In cores taken from the Gulf, scientists have found evidence of waves hundreds of meters high sweeping across the sea floor. The crater itself would have boiled with vaporized water and molten rock. Anything living nearby was annihilated in an instant. But the scar extended far beyond its rim, for the debris flung into the atmosphere darkened skies worldwide, carried the chemical fingerprints of Chicxulub across oceans and continents, and wrote the story of extinction in every corner of the globe. When satellites first revealed the circular anomaly beneath the Yucatan, it was not immediately obvious what it meant. It took decades of study, of drilling, of piecing together evidence from crystals, clay, fossils and geography to confirm that this was the impact site. For years, scientists debated whether the extinction had been caused by an asteroid or by massive volcanism in India. The crater was the decisive proof. It is the scar that shows the wound was real, not metaphorical. The dinosaurs did not fade away slowly. They were struck down in a single blow, and this was the place it happened. Standing on the Yucatan today, the scar is invisible, yet its presence is everywhere if you know where to look. The line of sea notes arcs across the peninsula, tracing the crater's edge. These sinkholes are filled with clear, cool water, sacred to the Maya who lived here long after the impact. To them they were entrances to the underworld, portals to the gods. They could not have known that the arc they formed was the mark of a catastrophe millions of years older than humanity. But their reverence was not misplaced. The cenotes are reminders that the Earth carries deep memory. Chicxulub is more than a scar. It is a turning point. Without it, the age of dinosaurs might have continued. Mammals might never have risen. Primates might never have evolved. Humans might never have existed. The scar is not only the end of one story, but the beginning of another. Every bird in the sky, every mammal on the ground, every forest that rose after the darkness is linked to this crater, to the moment when the Earth was struck and reset. The scar also tells us something humbling about our planet's vulnerability. Impacts are rare on human timescales, but in geological time they are inevitable. The Earth moves through space, and space is not empty. Asteroids and comets cross our orbit, some small, some large enough to scar a planet forever. Chicxulub is a reminder that worlds can change in minutes, that stability is fragile, that life itself depends on chance. To study the scar is not only to look into the past, but to understand the risks of the future. Imagine standing at the edge of the crater in the moments after the impact, if you could have survived. The sea would have been gone, replaced by a boiling hole of fire and vapour. The sky would have been a sheet of lightning, clouds of rock and water rising faster than sound. The ground would have heaved beneath your feet, waves of pressure racing outward. Within minutes, the rim mountains would rise and collapse, the sea would rush back in, and tsunamis would radiate across oceans. It would have been the most terrifying sight the Earth has ever seen, and yet today, walking across the Yucatan, you would see only forests, towns, and the hidden line of cenotes. The violence is gone, the scar remains. Cores drilled from the crater show that life returned even here, surprisingly quickly. Within years, microorganisms colonized the waters above the scar. Within thousands of years, the seafloor hosted communities again. Even in the place of greatest destruction, life found a way back. The scar did not remain barren. It became part of the living Earth again, even as it kept its memory in stone. That resilience is as much a part of Chicxulub's story as the destruction. The scar of Chicxulub is not visible like the Grand Canyon or Mount Everest. It is hidden, quiet, subtle. But its importance is unmatched. It is the place where history pivoted, where one age ended and another began. Every layer of melted rock, every grain of shocked quartz, every ring of cenotes is a word in that story. To stand on the Yucatan is to stand on the scar of the world's most famous wound, a wound that healed but never disappeared. The dinosaurs are gone, but the scar remains. The mammals rose, the forest returned, the ocean stabilized, but the crater is still there. Silent under the limestone, patient, enduring. It is the reminder that the Earth does not forget, that stone carries memory even when life moves on. Chicxulub is the scar that ended an age and began another, the place where the sky fell and the world was reborn. It is easy to speak of the asteroid in the past tense, to consign Chicxulub to history, to think of the dinosaurs as distant enough that their end feels like a story instead of a possibility. But space does not care for our sense of distance. The cosmos has not emptied itself of wandering rocks. Earth still spins through fields of debris, some no larger than dust, some as large as the mountain that ended an age. If an asteroid of that size were to appear again today, streaking toward us through the blackness, the story would not be one of dinosaurs. It would be ours. The first difference would be awareness. 66 million years ago, no eyes looked to the sky with knowledge of what was coming. No species had telescopes or satellites. No creatures understood trajectories or velocities. The impact came as a surprise to a world that could not imagine surprise. Today, we would see it coming. Telescopes would pick up the faint dot against the stars orbiting near Earth, perhaps years in advance. Scientists would calculate its path, release their findings, and the world would know a rock is on its way. Whether that would bring calm preparation or panic is another question entirely. If the asteroid were the size of Chicxulub's, 10 kilometers wide, there would be no doubt about the outcome. Technology might track it, governments might debate, but no missile, no nuclear device, No fleet of spacecraft could stop a rock of that size travelling at tens of kilometres per second. The energy released on impact would dwarf anything humanity has ever wielded. The difference is not whether we could stop it, but whether we could understand what it meant before it struck. Imagine the headlines, the broadcasts, the endless debates. Some would deny the danger, call it exaggerated. Others would insist on desperate measures, plans to deflect or destroy the asteroid with weapons untested for such a scale. Scientists would explain probabilities, impact zones, possible outcomes. Politicians would argue about who had responsibility to act, who had the resources, who should be saved. The world would be united in fear, but also divided in response. For years, perhaps, the rock would grow brighter in the sky, visible to the naked eye as a moving star, a reminder that time was running out. On the day of impact, the story would shift from anticipation to reality. The asteroid would strike not the shallow seas of the Cretaceous, but whatever part of Earth its path chose. Ocean or land, forest or city. If it landed in the ocean, tsunamis hundreds of meters high would race outward, drowning coasts on every continent. If it landed on land, the crater would swallow entire regions, vaporizing cities in a flash, leveling everything for hundreds of kilometers. Firestorms would ignite forests, grasslands and towns alike, spreading faster than any fire humanity has ever fought. And above all of it, the sky would darken. Satellites would capture the plume of dust, ash and vapor rising into the atmosphere, spreading across continents within days. Flights would ground, communications would falter, the world would dim, crops would wither in fields, temperatures would plunge, rains would turn acidic. Within months, the global food chain would collapse. Humanity, for all its technology, would face the same challenge as the dinosaurs. A world without sunlight. A world where survival depends not on strength or intelligence alone, but on endurance. Some might survive underground, in bunkers stocked with food and water, in places designed for catastrophe. Others might endure in isolated regions where conditions remained marginally better. But civilization as we know it would not endure. Power grids, supply chains, communication networks, all of them depend on stability, on light, on harvests, on oceans that function. When the sky turns black, when the air grows cold, when plants fail, all of that unravels. The impact would not simply kill by blast or fire, it would kill by silence, by famine, by years of darkness. The asteroid that ended the Cretaceous killed 3/4 of species on Earth. If it happened today, the statistics would include us. We're adaptable, we're clever, but we're not immune to the collapse of the systems we depend on. The story of if it happened today is not a tale of confidence in survival. It is a reminder that life on Earth is fragile, that even now, with all our technology, we live at the mercy of forces greater than ourselves. But there is another difference. Unlike the dinosaurs, we would understand what had happened. We would know it was an asteroid, not a sudden darkness without explanation. We would know the cause, even if we could not prevent the effect. That knowledge might give us no power to change the outcome, but it would give us something the dinosaurs never had. Awareness of our place in the universe, of our vulnerability, of our connection to deep time. And perhaps, if the asteroid were detected far enough in advance, there would be another possibility. Humanity has already begun to test methods of deflecting smaller asteroids, nudging them with spacecraft, altering their trajectories. For a 10-kilometre rock, those methods would be futile, but for smaller ones, they could make the difference between impact and avoidance. The lesson of Chicxulub is not only that impacts happen, but that they change everything. The lesson for us is to be ready, to take seriously the possibility that our story could end in the same way. The scar of Chicxulub is still there, hidden under the Yucatan, reminding us that the past is not gone, but waiting. If such an impact happened today, we would leave our own scar, perhaps on another part of the globe, perhaps on the ocean floor, perhaps across the heart of a continent. Our cities, Our monuments, our technologies would be buried in layers of ash and clay, and millions of years from now, another species might dig them up, reading our story the way we read the dinosaurs. They would find our fossils in the rocks, our artifacts in the strata, our silence in the absence above a boundary layer. The thought is humbling, sobering, and real. The possibility of another Chicxulub is not a fantasy. Astronomers have catalogued thousands of near-Earth objects, many small, some large. Their orbits are tracked, their movements predicted. But space is vast, and our vision is incomplete. New asteroids are discovered every year, some only after they pass by, too late for warning. The universe has not changed its nature. The same forces that ended the dinosaurs still exist, still operate, still move silently through the dark. To imagine it happening today is to imagine the fragility of everything we have built. It is to recognise that the systems we rely on are no stronger than the light that feeds them, the climate that sustains them, the stability of a sky that we take for granted. If it happened today, it would be the greatest disaster in human history, the end of civilization as we know it, the silencing of the human story, or at least its transformation into something unrecognisable. And yet, imagining it also reveals something else. Our ability to think beyond ourselves, to prepare, to look to the stars not only with wonder but with caution. The dinosaurs had no warning. We do. That difference may one day be the line between extinction and survival. The scar of Chicxulub tells us what has already happened. Our awareness tells us what could happen again. The question is whether we listen. Life on Earth has always walked a line between fragility and resilience. The asteroid that struck 66 million years ago exposed that truth more clearly than almost any other moment in history. It showed how quickly the balance can shatter, how easily abundance can collapse into scarcity, how swiftly entire worlds of creatures can vanish. But it also revealed something else, that even when life is reduced to its smallest forms, when the skies are dark and the seas are sour, when fire has scoured the land and the cold has settled deep, survival is still possible. Fragility and resilience are not opposites. They are partners, woven together in the story of every extinction and every recovery. Fragility is obvious in the dinosaurs. For millions of years they had dominated Earth, filling every corner of land, sky and swamp. They were vast in number, diverse in form, successful in every way evolution measures success. And yet, when the asteroid came, none of that saved them. Their size, their specialization, their dependence on ecosystems that required abundant plants and stable climates, all of these strengths became vulnerabilities in a world thrown into darkness. The very traits that had made them so powerful left them unable to bend when the world broke. They were fragile, not because they were weak, but because they had become too finely tuned to a world that suddenly ceased to exist. Resilience, on the other hand, was written in the small. It was in mammals that scurried in the shadows, able to eat insects, seeds, roots, whatever they could find. It was in birds that survived by adapting to new diets and nesting strategies. It was in plants whose seeds lay dormant beneath the ash, waiting for light to return. It was in ferns, quick to reclaim ground stripped bare. It was in fungi, thriving on decay when nothing else could. These were not dominant creatures in the Cretaceous. They were not impressive, not celebrated, not rulers of their world. But they were resilient, and when the great were toppled, they endured. The fossil record is filled with reminders of this dual truth. Mass extinctions have struck Earth more than once. The Great Dying at the end of the Permian, the collapse of marine life in the Ordovician, the devastation of the Triassic. Each time, fragility was exposed and resilience revealed. Lineages that seemed unshakable vanished. Lineages that seemed minor flourished. Evolution does not reward strength alone. It rewards flexibility, adaptability, the ability to survive in conditions never before encountered. Resilience is not about being the biggest or the fiercest. It is about being able to bend without breaking, to wait without vanishing, to take root in broken soil. When we look back at the asteroid impact, it is tempting to see only destruction. But what we also see is resilience written into every survivor. The mammals that hid in burrows did not just survive by chance. They had bodies suited to warmth in the cold, diets suited to scarcity, behaviours suited to caution. The birds that carried their lineage forward did so by exploiting food sources others could not, by reproducing quickly, by dispersing across landscapes. The plants that rebuilt forests did so by producing seeds that could wait, by sprouting quickly when light returned, by partnering with insects and animals in new ways. Each survival was fragile in its own right. Many individuals died, many attempts failed, but enough succeeded to prove that resilience was woven deep into life's fabric. Fragility and resilience are also written in Earth itself. The planet is vulnerable to forces from beyond, asteroids, comets, radiation bursts. It is fragile in the face of cosmic chance, but it is also resilient. Its cycles of rock, water and atmosphere continue even when disrupted. After the asteroid, the skies cleared, the ocean stabilized, the forests rose, the wound healed, leaving scars but not permanent ruin. The Earth has endured countless catastrophes, and each time it has found equilibrium again. Fragility and resilience exist side by side in the very crust, mantle and air of our world. For us, the lesson is clear. Humanity is fragile in ways we prefer not to admit. We rely on crops that depend on stable climates, on oceans that sustain fisheries, on infrastructure that can be shattered by disaster. We are not immune to famine, disease or environmental collapse. A single impact, a volcanic eruption, a shift in climate could unravel the systems we take for granted. And yet we are resilient too. We adapt, we invent, we migrate, we plan. Our intelligence, our cooperation, our ability to see patterns and prepare give us tools no other species has ever had. Fragility and resilience are not choices for us. They are conditions we live with, as every species has before us. Imagine the world just years after the impact. Dinosaurs gone, forests burned, skies dim. It would have been easy to see only fragility, to imagine that life itself was on the edge of collapse. But within decades, green shoots pushed through ash. Within centuries, mammals diversified. Within millennia, forests thickened again. The silence of extinction was followed by the hum of renewal. Resilience was never absent. It was simply quiet, waiting its turn. When paleontologists study fossils from this period, they do not only count the vanished, they also count the survivors. They trace how a lineage of small mammals gave rise to elephants and whales. They follow how early primates evolved into apes and humans. They see how a fragile sprout in the shadow of catastrophe became the foundation of entire ecosystems. They see resilience not as an afterthought, but as the core of life's story. Fragility gives extinction its sharp edge. Resilience gives recovery its enduring arc. Without fragility, life would not change. Without resilience, life would not continue. Together, they are the rhythm of Earth's history, the rise and fall, the ending and beginning, the silence and renewal. And so, when we think of the asteroid, we must think not only of what was lost, but of what survived. We must think of fragility and resilience as twin truths, both humbling and inspiring. They remind us that life is never secure, never guaranteed, but also never helpless, never without possibility. They remind us that we too are fragile, but we too are resilient. If the sky ever falls again, it will test both in us, as it has in every creature before. We have walked together through the shadow of catastrophe, through darkness and cold, through the silence that followed fire, through the slow return of green, through the rise of mammals, through the scars written in stone and the whispers preserved in fossils. Now, as we reach the end of this journey, it is worth pausing, looking back and asking what all of it means. The asteroid that struck 66 million years ago was one of the most violent moments in Earth's long history, but its story is not just destruction. It is a reminder of how fragile life is, how resilient it can be, and how deeply connected we are to everything that came before. We began with the day the sky fell, when a rock from space tore into the Earth and ended an age. That moment is easy to picture in flashes of fire and chaos, but it is harder to picture in its silence. It was not only an explosion, it was a long night, a cold that settled into soil and ocean, a loss that rippled across every continent. Dinosaurs, ammonites, pterosaurs, entire worlds of creatures were gone in what felt like an instant. The silence of their absence is what echoes most strongly through the fossil record, and yet, if we stop there, we miss the larger truth. The story was not only about endings, it was about what came after. The mammals that survived were not mighty. They were small, timid, often overlooked. But when the giants vanished, those small survivors carried forward the thread of life. They were not chosen, they were not destined. They were simply able to bend when the world broke. From them came all the diversity of the Cenozoic: elephants, whales, primates, humans. From them came the birds that sing outside our windows, the forests that shade our paths, the ecosystems we depend on every day. If the asteroid had not struck, the world would be different, and perhaps we would not be here at all. Our own existence is tied to that moment of destruction and recovery. It is strange to think of ourselves as children of catastrophe, but in a way, we are. We are here because something ended. We are here because fragility gave way to resilience, because life found new paths, because forests grew again, because seeds waited and survived. The scar of Chicxulub is not just a reminder of extinction. It is a reminder that from endings come beginnings, that from silence comes new songs. That is both humbling and hopeful. As we reflect, we also see how much the Earth remembers. Fossils, crystals, clays, boundary layers, they are all voices of the past carrying messages across millions of years. They do not exaggerate, they do not forget. They show us clearly that extinction is real, that catastrophes reshape the planet, that resilience is never guaranteed but always possible. To listen to the Earth is to learn patience. It is to learn that change is constant, that survival is not simple, that beauty and loss are always intertwined. There is also a lesson here for our own time. We like to think of ourselves as separate from the creatures that came before, as if intelligence makes us exempt from the patterns of fragility and resilience. But it does not. We are vulnerable to climate shifts, to ecosystem collapse, to the balance of sunlight and soil. The asteroid reminds us that stability is fragile, that life depends on forces beyond our control. But it also reminds us that resilience is possible, that survival is never only about strength, but about adaptability, cooperation, endurance. If an asteroid were to come again, the story might include us, and we would face the same test the dinosaurs did. But unlike them, we know what happened before. We know the scar of Chicxulub. We know the silence of the fossil record. We know the resilience of mammals and plants. That knowledge is a form of resilience in itself, a chance to prepare, to adapt, to look beyond ourselves. Awareness does not erase fragility, but it gives us tools to face it. And so, as we close this journey, we return to the image of the sky. Once it fell. Once it darkened for years. Once it was filled with fire and ash, but it cleared. The sun returned. Forests rose. Life spread again. The sky today is the same sky that once carried debris from Chicxulub, the same sky that once glowed with fire. When you look at it, you are looking at both fragility and resilience, at both endings and beginnings. We are part of that story. Every bird in the sky is a descendant of dinosaurs that endured. Every tree in the forest is part of a lineage that survived fire and ash. Every mammal, including us, is here because small creatures once waited in burrows and outlasted giants. The asteroid was not the end of life. It was a turning point. We live in the world it created, whether we realise it or not. So what do we take from this? Perhaps a sense of humility, that we are not immune to forces greater than us. Perhaps a sense of gratitude, that we exist at all, that we are heirs to resilience older than humanity itself. Perhaps a sense of responsibility, to treat this fragile, resilient Earth with care, to remember that our future depends on how well we adapt, how well we endure, how well we listen to the lessons written in stone. And with that, let me thank you for walking through this story with me. If you found it soothing, if you found it thought-provoking, consider liking and subscribing, because here we speak not only of Earth's beauty but of its scars, not only of its abundance but of its losses, not only of what it gives but of what it remembers. Until next time, wherever you are, look at the sky, remember its fragility, and trust in its resilience. After all, it is the same sky that has carried life forward through darkness, through silence, through fire, into dawn.